Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin tonight in China. And before your brain goes straight to the Great Wall or the terracotta warriors or the image of a vast ancient empire stretching across the map of Asia, I need you to understand something that most accounts of ancient China get fundamentally wrong. China was not simply a civilization that lasted a long time. China was a civilization that solved the problem of governing large numbers of human beings across vast distances with a sophistication and a consistency that no other civilization in the ancient or medieval world matched. The rules that made that possible were not the rules of force alone. They were the rules of a philosophical system so comprehensive and so deeply embedded in the culture that it shaped everything from how you mourned your parents, to how you addressed a letter, to how you sat at a dinner table, to how you thought about the nature of the universe itself. And those rules were strange, magnificently, inexplicably, completely logically strange. So if you are ready, let us step into the civilization that has been continuously inhabited longer than any other on Earth, and find out what it was actually like to live there. Starting, as always, with the rules. If you wake up as a scholar in the Han Dynasty capital of Chang'an, in the year 100 before our era, during the reign of Emperor Wu, one of the most ambitious and consequential rulers in Chinese history, the first thing you notice is that your entire life is organized around a single overriding ambition. You want to pass the examination. Not just any examination, the Imperial Civil Service examination that stands between you and a position in the bureaucracy that governs the most populous empire on Earth. The examination that your family has been preparing you for since you were old enough to hold a brush. The examination that your father and your grandfather and possibly your great-grandfather attempted before you with varying degrees of success. The examination that determines not just your individual fate, but the fate of your entire family line for generations. The Han Dynasty examination system was not the elaborate multi-tiered structure it would become under the Tang and Song dynasties. It was still being developed, still being refined, still finding its shape, but the principle was already clearly established. Access to official position should be determined by demonstrated knowledge of the classical texts, and by demonstrated capacity for moral reasoning, not by birth alone, not by wealth alone, not by military achievement alone. The idea was radical in the context of the ancient world. It was imperfectly applied from the beginning, and it shaped Chinese governance in ways that persisted for 2,000 years. The classical texts that the examination tested were not simply a curriculum, they were a cosmological framework. The 5 classics attributed to Confucius and his disciples, the Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the Book of Rites, the Book of Changes, and the Spring and Autumn Annals, contained within them a complete theory of how the universe worked, how human society should be organized to reflect that cosmic order, what the proper relationships between ruler and minister, father and son, husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, and friend required of each party, and what the consequences were of failing to maintain those relationships in their correct form. The Book of Rites alone was a document of extraordinary specificity. It specified the correct number of musical instruments appropriate to a ceremony of each rank level. It specified the correct dimensions of the burial mound appropriate to each level of the nobility. It specified the correct mourning garments for each category of relative, and the correct duration of each mourning period. It specified the correct posture for addressing a superior, the correct way to receive a gift, the correct way to offer wine at a banquet, the correct distance to maintain from a person of higher rank when walking together. Nothing in the social life of a properly educated hand gentleman was accidental or improvised. Everything had a correct form specified by a tradition that was understood as both humanly constructed and cosmically necessary. The mourning rules in particular were among the most practically consequential and most genuinely burdensome regulations that the Confucian system imposed on anyone who took it seriously. The death of a father required 3 years of mourning. In practice, this meant 25 months of strict observance during which you wore coarse, undyed hemp garments rather than the silk appropriate to your rank, ate plain food without meat or wine, abstained from music and entertainment and sexual intercourse, wept at specified times according to a specified schedule, slept on a mat with a clod of earth as a pillow rather than on your regular bed, and if you held official position, resigned that position immediately to return home and observe the full mourning period before any return to official life was permitted. The resignation requirement was not merely conventional, it was legally enforced. An official who continued in his post after his father's death without resigning was committing a violation of ritual propriety that could result in serious legal consequences and permanent damage to his reputation. The Tang Dynasty legal code specified the period of mourning leave that officials were entitled to and the consequences for those who failed to observe it. The Song dynasty produced elaborate jurisprudential discussions about edge cases. What if the official was in the middle of a military campaign when his father died? What if his post was so critical that his absence would endanger the state? The answers to these questions were worked out in careful detail by scholars who took both the ritual requirement and the practical necessity seriously, and who attempted to reconcile them through reasoning that was simultaneously legal, philosophical, and theological. The logic behind the 3-year mourning period was as specific as everything else in the Confucian system. The infant spends 3 years completely dependent on its parents before it can walk reliably, feed itself, and begin to manage the basic functions of existence independently. During those 3 years, the parents give everything and ask nothing. The mourning period is the reciprocal of that gift. 3 years of the child's adult life devoted to the memory of the parent, in a form that visibly demonstrates that the obligation is understood and honored. The reasoning was explicit in the classical texts and was not apologized for or softened. It was presented as a straightforward account of what gratitude and obligation required. The Confucian rules about the proper conduct of ceremonies reveal a dimension of Chinese social life that is easy to misunderstand if you approach it with modern assumptions about the relationship between form and substance. The modern tendency is to think of ceremony as superficial, as the decorative wrapper around the real content of a relationship or a transaction. The Confucian understanding was precisely the opposite. The ceremony was not the wrapper, the ceremony was the substance. The correct performance of a ceremony did not express a pre-existing relationship. It constituted that relationship. A father who performed the correct ceremonies with his son was not demonstrating his love for his son through a ceremonial medium. He was creating the social reality of fatherhood through the performance of the ceremonies that fatherhood required. This is why the rules about ceremony in the Confucian system were so specific and so seriously enforced. Using funeral music at a wedding was not a mistake of taste. It was an ontological error that disrupted the social reality that the correct ceremonies were designed to create. Using the number of ritual vessels appropriate to a duke at a ceremony conducted by someone of lower rank was not an extravagance. It was a claim to a social reality that did not exist, and that the claim itself threatened to undermine. The rules about ceremony were rules about the fabric of social reality, and violating them was not simply bad manners. It was a form of lying about what the world was. The rules about music in the Confucian system deserve their own extended treatment because they reveal how comprehensively the system regulated every domain of human experience. Confucius himself is reported to have said that he did not know what to make of a man who was not moved by music, and the Confucian tradition developed an elaborate theory of the relationship between music, moral character, and social order that has no exact equivalent in any other philosophical tradition. The theory held that different musical modes produced different emotional states in listeners, and that those emotional states in turn produced different moral dispositions. Music in the correct modes, harmonious, dignified, measured, produced the emotional equilibrium that sustained correct moral behavior. Music in incorrect modes, wild, excessive, erotic, subversive, produced the emotional disruption that led to moral failure and ultimately to social disorder. The rules about what music was appropriate in what contexts were therefore not rules about aesthetic preference. They were rules about social hygiene, about the management of the emotional conditions that produced moral conduct or undermined it. The specific musical instruments permitted at ceremonies of different ranks were specified in the Book of Rites with a precision that reflected this theory. The Son of Heaven was entitled to arrange musicians on all four sides of his ceremonial space. A feudal lord was entitled to musicians on 3 sides. A high minister on 2 sides, a scholar on 1 side. These were not arbitrary status markers. They reflected a theory about the relationship between the scale of musical performance and the moral authority of the person being honored. To arrange musicians on all 4 sides when you were only entitled to 1 side was to claim a moral authority that had not been earned and that the incorrect ceremony was dishonestly asserting. The Han Dynasty rules about the relationship between the emperor and his ministers reveal the specific form that the Confucian theory of political authority took in practice, and it was considerably more complicated than the simple model of imperial absolutism that many people assume characterized traditional Chinese government. The Confucian theory held that the emperor ruled by virtue of the mandate of heaven, the divine authorization that heaven conferred on rulers who governed justly and withdrew from those who did not. This was not simply a theological decoration on political power. It was a genuine constraint on imperial authority that was enforced through a specific set of institutional mechanisms. The institution of remonstrance, the formal obligation of high officials to criticize imperial conduct when it deviated from the standards that the mandate required, was one of the most important and most characteristically Chinese political institutions. A minister who failed to remonstrate against imperial misconduct was violating his duty as a minister, just as surely as a son who failed to mourn his father was violating his duty as a son. The remonstrance was not a right, but an obligation, and the minister who exercised it was expected to do so regardless of the personal consequences. The personal consequences could be severe. Emperors who received remonstrance that they found unwelcome were not constitutionally prohibited from punishing the minister who delivered it. The history of Chinese imperial governance is full of ministers who were beaten, demoted, exiled, or executed for delivering remonstrances that their emperors found intolerable. But the tradition was also full of ministers who delivered remonstrances anyway, who accepted the punishment as the price of fulfilling their official duty, and whose courage in doing so was celebrated as one of the highest expressions of the Confucian ideal of official conduct. The minister who remonstrated and was beaten and returned to remonstrate again and was beaten again was not simply stubborn. He was embodying the principle that the correct performance of duty was more important than personal survival, which was the official version of the same principle that the Spartan tradition embodied in the military context. The Han Dynasty rules about the conduct of the imperial audience, the elaborate ceremonial in which the emperor received his officials, were specified in the ritual texts with the same precision as every other aspect of Han court life. Officials approaching the emperor performed a specific sequence of prostrations, the kowtow, in which the forehead touched the floor at specified intervals in the approach. The kowtow was not simply a mark of submission. It was a performance of the cosmic relationship between the ruler who held the mandate of heaven and the official who served that mandate. To perform it correctly was to participate in the correct ordering of the universe. To perform it incorrectly or to refuse it was to disrupt that order in a way that had consequences beyond the individual moment. When foreign ambassadors arrived at the Han court and were asked to perform the kowtow, the question of whether they would comply was not simply a question of diplomatic protocol. It was a question of whether they acknowledged the cosmic authority that the Han Emperor's position represented. An ambassador who refused the kowtow was not simply being rude. He was denying the cosmic framework within which the Han court understood its own authority, which was why the question was taken so seriously and why the responses to it, the elaborate negotiations about modified forms of the ceremony that might satisfy both the ritual requirements of the Chinese court and the dignity expectations of foreign rulers, occupied so much diplomatic energy in the history of Chinese foreign relations. The rules about writing and the brush in Han Dynasty China reveal a dimension of Chinese culture that has no exact equivalent in the Western tradition. The brush-written Chinese characters that constituted the written language were not simply a practical communication system. They were simultaneously an art form, a spiritual practice, and a moral indicator. The quality of a person's calligraphy was understood to reveal the quality of their character in a direct and immediate way. A hand that produced beautiful, controlled, harmonious characters was the hand of a person who had achieved the inner harmony and outer discipline that the Confucian tradition required. A hand that produced chaotic, poorly formed, uncontrolled characters was revealing something about the state of the person's inner life that no amount of verbal protestation could conceal. This belief was not simply an aesthetic prejudice. It was grounded in the Confucian theory of the relationship between inner character and outer expression, the theory that what a person is will inevitably manifest in what they do. If that theory was correct, then the most intimate and most practiced form of physical expression, the daily act of writing, would inevitably reveal the true state of the writer's character. Training the hand to produce beautiful calligraphy was therefore not simply an aesthetic exercise. It was a form of moral cultivation, a practice through which the disciplined movement of the brush was training the practitioner in precisely the kind of controlled, harmonious, purposeful action that Confucian ethics required in every domain of life. The examination question that asked candidates to write essays demonstrating their knowledge of the classics was therefore also an examination of their calligraphy, and the calligraphy was also an examination of their character, and the examination of their character was ultimately an examination of their fitness to govern. The three elements were not separate. They were aspects of the same thing, which was the assessment of whether this person had achieved the inner and outer cultivation that official service required. The Han Dynasty rules about astronomy and the calendar reveal a dimension of imperial authority that is easy to overlook, but that was central to the ideological structure of Chinese imperial rule. The emperor was the mediator between heaven and earth, the person whose virtue maintained the correct alignment between the cosmic order and the human social order. The calendar was the practical expression of that alignment, the instrument through which the rhythms of heaven were brought into correspondence with the rhythms of human activity. To control the calendar was therefore to exercise the authority of heaven, and the imperial monopoly on calendar making was not simply an administrative convenience, but a claim to cosmic authority. The imperial astronomers who maintained the calendar, who predicted eclipses and identified unusual celestial phenomena, and who interpreted their significance for the court, were not simply scientists. They were priests of a natural theology, in which the behavior of the heavens was a continuous communication from the cosmic order about the state of human governance, An eclipse occurring during a military campaign was not a coincidence. It was a message about the moral fitness of the campaign and the authority of the ruler who ordered it. A comet appearing during a period of drought was not unrelated to the drought. Both were symptoms of the same disruption in the cosmic human alignment that the emperor's virtue was supposed to maintain. The rules about what happened when celestial phenomena indicated that the cosmic human alignment had been disrupted were specific and practically consequential. The emperor was expected to respond to unfavorable celestial events with specific acts of moral self-examination and public contrition. He might issue an edict acknowledging that his governance had fallen short of what the mandate required. He might reduce his personal consumption of food, wine, and entertainment. He might order the release of prisoners. He might dismiss officials whose conduct had been particularly problematic. The celestial event was a communication that required a response, and the response was a public performance of imperial moral accountability that had real political consequences. The rules about the Chinese court diet and the management of the imperial kitchen reveal another dimension of how comprehensively the Chinese philosophical system regulated the details of daily life. The imperial diet was not simply the provision of food to the ruler. It was a cosmological project organized around the principles of balance between the 5 flavors corresponding to the 5 elements, the maintenance of seasonal appropriateness in what was consumed, and the preservation of the physical health of the person whose virtue maintained the cosmic order. The imperial physicians who managed the emperor's health were therefore not simply medical practitioners, they were cosmological technicians, whose responsibility was to keep the mediator between heaven and earth in the physical condition that his cosmic function required. The rules governing the preparation of imperial food specified not just what ingredients were permitted, but the correct combinations of ingredients to maintain the appropriate balance of flavors. The correct cooking methods to preserve the essential qualities of each ingredient, and the correct timing of meals in relation to the rhythms of the day and the season. The specific rules about the 5 flavors theory, which assigned each flavor to a specific element, organ, season, and direction, and which specified the consequences of excess or deficiency of each flavor for the health of the corresponding organ, were the practical expression of a medical theory that was simultaneously a cosmological theory. Eating too much of the sour flavor weakened the liver. Eating too much of the bitter flavor weakened the heart. Eating too much of the sweet flavor weakened the spleen. The ruler whose diet was correctly managed according to these principles was a ruler whose body was maintained in alignment with the cosmic order, which was a precondition for his governance being similarly aligned. Now let us move from the imperial court to the ordinary life of the Han Dynasty Chinese, because the rules that governed daily life for the majority of the population were different in their specifics from the rules of the court, but equally organized around the same underlying framework. The village life of Han Dynasty China was structured by the same Confucian values that governed the court, applied to the smaller scale of family and community, rather than the larger scale of empire and cosmos. The rules about filial piety in ordinary Han families were as specific and as seriously enforced as the rules about official mourning at court. A son who struck his father was committing one of the most serious offences in the Han legal code. The punishment for striking a parent was significantly more severe than the punishment for striking any other person, because the offence was not simply an act of physical violence, but a violation of the cosmic order that the parent-child relationship embodied. The severity of the punishment reflected the severity of the disruption to the social fabric that the act represented. The rules about the management of family property across generations were organized around the principle that the family was a unit that persisted across time, not simply a collection of individuals who happened to be related. The property of the family belonged to the family as a continuous entity, not to the current generation as individuals. An individual member of the family did not own his share of the family property in the way that modern property law would recognize. He had the use of it, subject to the obligations that family membership imposed, and the duty to maintain it and transmit it to the next generation in a condition at least as good as he had received it. This conception of family property had practical consequences for how economic decisions were made in Han Dynasty families. A decision to sell family land required the consent of the relevant senior family members, not just the individual who nominally controlled that portion of the property. A decision to make a major investment required consideration of its effects on the family's capacity to meet its ritual obligations, which included the maintenance of the ancestral sacrifices that connected the living family to its dead ancestors. The ancestral sacrifices were not optional observances that could be suspended when times were difficult. They were obligations that the living owed to the dead, and that the failure to perform had consequences in the cosmic accounting that the Confucian system maintained. The ancestral temple, the physical space where the tablets of the deceased ancestors were maintained, and where the ritual offerings were made, was the most sacred space in the ordinary Chinese home. It was more important than any other room. The rules about who could enter it, what could be done there, what the correct forms of the sacrifices were, and who was responsible for maintaining it, were specified in the ritual texts and enforced by the combined weight of family tradition, social pressure, and the genuine belief that the ancestors were present and aware, and that their goodwill or displeasure was a real force in the life of the family. The relationship between the living and the dead in Han Dynasty China was not the relationship between the present and the past that modern secular thought assumes. The ancestors were not simply people who had once lived and whose memory was being honored. They were presences whose continued existence in the afterlife depended on the maintenance of the sacrifices that the living provided, and whose goodwill or displeasure was a real force that affected the prosperity, health, and success of the living family. The rules about the ancestral sacrifices were therefore not simply rules about ritual observance. They were rules about the maintenance of a relationship with real consequences for the people involved in it. The Han Dynasty rules about gender and the management of the household reveal a social organization that was patriarchal in its formal structure, but considerably more complex in its actual operation. The formal rules placed women under the authority of their fathers before marriage, their husbands after marriage, and their sons after the death of their husbands. These rules were real and had real consequences for the legal and economic situation of women throughout their lives. But the actual operation of the Han household frequently departed from the formal ideal in ways that gave women, particularly elder women in large family households, considerable practical authority that the formal rules did not acknowledge. The mother-in-law in a Han Dynasty household occupied a position of genuine authority over her daughter-in-law that was recognized and enforced by the social norms of the community, even though the formal rules placed both women under the authority of the husband and father. The daughter-in-law who failed to show appropriate deference to her mother-in-law was not simply failing to observe a social convention. She was violating the hierarchical principles that the Confucian system applied to gender relations, just as rigorously as it applied them to political relations. The mother-in-law's authority was the authority of age and seniority within the domestic hierarchy, and its violation was treated with the same seriousness as any other violation of hierarchical principle. The rules about how different grades of eunuchs could dress, what titles they could bear, how they were to be addressed, and how they were to address their superiors, reveal a dimension of Han court life that is both fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. The eunuchs who staffed the imperial inner palace were not simply servants. They were a specific category of person created by a specific physical operation that was simultaneously a mutilation, a social transformation, and an entry into a world of proximity to imperial power that was available to no one else. The rules governing their existence were therefore rules governing a category of person that had no equivalent outside the imperial system, and that the imperial system had created specifically to serve its own structural needs. The need that eunuchs served was the need for male attendants who could safely be present in the inner palace where the emperor's women lived without creating the possibility of unauthorized sexual access that would undermine the certainty of imperial paternity. The solution of employing castrated males was ancient and widespread across multiple cultures that faced the same structural problem. The specific rules that governed the lives of Han eunuchs reflected both the practical function they served and the social ambiguity their existence created. They were male in origin and in some formal legal categories. They were female in their domestic role and in their physical transformation. They were servants with no independent social standing. They were occasionally the most powerful people in the empire, because their physical proximity to the emperor gave them access to imperial attention and imperial decision-making that no minister could match from the other side of the ceremonial barriers that separated the inner and outer palace. The history of Han Dynasty political decline is in significant measure the history of eunuch political power, growing to the point where it challenged and eventually exceeded the power of the Confucian-educated officials who were supposed to govern the empire. The rules about what eunuchs could and could not do were repeatedly tightened and repeatedly violated in a cycle that reflected the fundamental tension between the structural role eunuchs played in the imperial household and the Confucian principle that governance required the moral cultivation that the examination system was designed to produce and that eunuchs by definition had not undergone. The rules about Chinese medicine in the Han Dynasty reveal a medical system that was simultaneously sophisticated and entirely different in its theoretical foundations from anything in the Western tradition. Chinese medicine in this period was organized around a theory of the body as a system of flowing energies, the qi, which circulated through specific pathways, the meridians, connecting the organs to the surface of the body and to each other. Health was the correct flow of qi through these pathways. Disease was the disruption of that flow, either through blockage, deficiency, or excess, in one or more of the meridians or organs. The rules governing the practice of medicine in Han Dynasty China were therefore rules about the management of qi flow. The specific acupuncture points at which needles could be inserted to regulate qi flow were specified in texts that were simultaneously medical manuals and cosmological documents. Because the theory of qi flow in the body was connected to the same theory of cosmic energy flow that organized the Chinese understanding of the natural world more broadly. The meridians of the body were not simply anatomical pathways. They were microcosmic reflections of the cosmic energy channels that connected heaven and earth and maintained the order of the natural world. The dietary rules of Han Dynasty medicine were organized around the same theory. Foods were classified by their effects on qi, their temperature properties, their associations with the 5 elements and the 5 organs, and their appropriateness to different seasons, different constitutional types, and different disease conditions. A patient with a condition characterized by excess heat in the liver required cooling foods that supported the liver's yin aspect. A patient with a condition characterized by deficiency of spleen qi required warming foods that supported the spleen's yang aspect. The rules were specific, interconnected, and organized around a theory that was internally coherent, even if its foundations differed entirely from the anatomical and biochemical foundations of modern medicine. The Han Dynasty rules about architecture and urban planning reflect the same cosmological framework that organized every other domain of Han social life. The placement of buildings on a site, the orientation of the main entrance, the relationship between the buildings and the cardinal directions, the management of water flow through the site, were all governed by rules derived from the theory of chi flow that also organized medicine and music and government and family relations. A building whose entrance faced south, the direction associated with yang energy, fire, and the principle of illumination, was a building correctly oriented to receive the beneficial qi that the cosmic order provided. A building whose orientation was incorrect was a building that was disrupting the qi flow of the site in ways that would have consequences for the health, prosperity, and moral clarity of its occupants. The geomantic principles that governed building placement and orientation, the tradition known in Chinese as feng shui and in Western scholarship as Chinese geomancy, were not separate from the Confucian system but deeply connected to it. The same cosmic energies that the ruler's virtue was supposed to maintain in correct alignment at the imperial level were the same energies that the placement of a village house was supposed to harmonize at the domestic level. The rules about building orientation were therefore not simply aesthetic or traditional. They were applications of cosmological principles to the specific challenge of creating human habitations that were in harmony with, rather than in opposition to, the cosmic order. And now we cross the Sea of Japan and step into a world that absorbed the Chinese cosmological framework and transformed it into something distinctly its own, adding a layer of aesthetic intensity and a specific theory of the relationship between beauty and truth that gave Japanese feudal culture its distinctive character. The samurai of feudal Japan are perhaps the most romanticized warriors in the popular imagination of any culture, and the romanticization has done what romanticization always does, which is to simplify and to sentimentalize something that was actually far more complex, far more contradictory, and far more interesting than the simplified version suggests. If you are a samurai in the service of a daimyo, a feudal lord, in the year 1500, you are living through one of the most violent and most politically unstable periods in Japanese history, the Sengoku Jidai, the era of warring states, in which the centralized authority of the shogunate has effectively collapsed, and the country is divided among dozens of competing warlords, each fighting for dominance. The rules that govern your existence are not the refined philosophical constructions of the later Edo period Bushido. They are the practical codes of a professional warrior class operating in conditions of genuine political uncertainty and genuine physical danger, where the wrong choice about which lord to serve or about how to behave in a specific situation of military or political crisis could end your life, destroy your family, and eliminate your lineage. The fundamental obligation of the samurai in the Sengoku period was loyalty to the lord, the daimyo, who provided land, income, and social status in exchange for military service and absolute obedience. This loyalty was real, but also pragmatic, in ways that the later idealization of samurai loyalty obscured. Samurai in the Sengoku period changed lords with some frequency. When a lord was defeated, when he died without a suitable heir, when his policies threatened the survival of his retainers' families, changing allegiance was not only acceptable, but often the only rational option available. The rules about loyalty specified the form of the obligation and the conditions under which it could be terminated, not an absolute prohibition on ever-changing sides. The rules about how a samurai was expected to die are the aspect of the tradition that has most thoroughly captured the popular imagination, and they were real rules with real social consequences that shaped the behavior of real people in ways that we should neither romanticize nor dismiss. The principle that a warrior who had failed in a significant way, or who faced capture, or who had been the cause of serious damage to his lord's position, was expected to take his own life rather than live with the shame of failure, was enforced not by legal prohibition, but by the social reality that a samurai who survived when he should have died was a samurai whose continued presence in the community was an embarrassment to himself and his lord. The specific form of the ritual, the seppuku, was prescribed in considerable detail. The warrior wore specific garments. He was positioned in a specific way. He wrote a death poem if he had the literary training to do so, which among samurai of any education was expected. He performed the act with a specific instrument, and he had beside him a kaisha konin, a second whose role was to complete the act by decapitation once the initial cut had been made, shortening the duration of the dying and allowing the warrior to maintain his composure through the most difficult part of the process. The rules of seppuku were rules about how to die well, which in the samurai tradition meant dying in a way that demonstrated the same qualities of courage, composure, and correct form that had been expected of the warrior throughout his life. The death poem, the jisei that a samurai was expected to compose in the moments before seppuku, reveals the aesthetic dimension of the samurai tradition that had no equivalent in the Spartan or Roman military traditions. The warrior who was about to die was expected to produce a poem, not just any poem, but a poem that demonstrated literary cultivation, philosophical equanimity, and the specific aesthetic sensibility that Japanese culture associated with the correct perception of mortality. The best death poems in the Japanese tradition are genuinely extraordinary literary works, achieving in a few syllables a compression of insight about the nature of impermanence that entire philosophical treatises could not match. That they were produced by men who were about to kill themselves makes them stranger and more moving simultaneously. The rules about the samurai sword, the katana, were among the most elaborate and most seriously observed in the entire tradition. The sword was not simply a weapon, it was the soul of the samurai, the physical expression of his identity and his values, the object through which the warrior's relationship to his lord, his tradition, and his own death was made concrete. The rules about how the sword was to be handled, maintained, carried, and used were correspondingly elaborate. You did not touch another person's sword without explicit permission. You did not step over a sword that was placed on the floor. You did not point the blade toward a person of higher rank. You did not draw the sword in a context that did not justify its use and then resheath it without having used it, because drawing the sword was a declaration of deadly intent, and resheathing it without having fulfilled that intent was a form of dishonesty that the sword itself could not tolerate. The maintenance of the sword was a ritual practice as well as a practical one. The specific oils used for cleaning, the specific cloths used for polishing, the specific techniques for maintaining the edge were transmitted from swordsmith to swordsmith and from master to student as knowledge that combined technical expertise with aesthetic judgment and spiritual understanding. A sword that was poorly maintained was a sword whose owner was failing in his obligations not just to a material object, but to the tradition the object embodied. And a sword that was beautifully maintained, whose blade showed the characteristic hamon, the crystalline pattern at the edge produced by the differential tempering of the steel, was a sword whose beauty was simultaneously functional, aesthetic, and spiritual, a perfection of form that was also a perfection of purpose, which was the ideal toward which the samurai tradition in all its dimensions was directed. The rules about how samurai ranked relative to each other and how those rankings were expressed in everyday social interaction were as elaborate as the Chinese rules about ritual precedence and were enforced with the same seriousness. The honorific language of Japanese, in which different grammatical forms are used depending on the relative status of speaker and addressee, was not simply a feature of the language. It was a continuous enactment of the social hierarchy in every act of speech, a system in which the correct form of address was simultaneously a grammatical requirement and a moral obligation. To use the wrong level of honorific was not simply a grammatical error, it was a social misrepresentation, a claim about the relative status of the parties that was either too humble or too presumptuous, and that required correction. The rules about the chonin, the urban merchant class, reveal a specifically Japanese version of the tension we have seen in every society between commercial activity and the moral framework that the dominant tradition espoused. In the Japanese Confucian hierarchy of occupations, the samurai class occupied the top because they served the state and embodied the military virtues. The farmers occupied the second position because they produced the food on which everyone depended. The artisans occupied the third position because they transformed raw materials into useful objects. The merchants occupied the fourth and lowest position because they were understood to produce nothing themselves, but only to redistribute what others had produced, taking a profit from the difference between buying price and selling price without adding any value in the process. This hierarchical assessment of commercial activity was not simply an abstract philosophical position. It had practical consequences for the legal status, the residential location, the dress regulations, the permitted forms of display, and the social interactions of the merchant class. Merchants were not permitted to wear silk, which was reserved for the samurai class. They were not permitted to carry swords. They were required to live in specific areas of the city. Their testimony in legal proceedings carried less weight than the testimony of samurai or farmers. And yet, by the Edo period, the merchant class had accumulated wealth that enormously exceeded that of many samurai families, creating the paradox of a legally despised class that was economically dominant, which generated its own extraordinary culture of aesthetic refinement and artistic patronage that is one of the great achievements of Japanese civilization. The rules about the tea ceremony, the chaido or way of tea, reveal the Japanese genius for transforming the mundane into the transcendent through the application of aesthetic rules so specific and so seriously observed that the preparation and consumption of a bowl of tea becomes a philosophical practice. The rules of the tea ceremony were developed primarily by the tea master Senno Rikyu in the 16th century, and were organized around the principles of wabi and sabi, the aesthetic values of rustic simplicity and the beauty of impermanence, that expressed a specifically Japanese philosophical response to the transience of human experience. The rules specified the correct movement for entering the tea room through the small door, the neja guchi, that required every guest to bow low regardless of their social rank, creating an equality of humility at the threshold of the space. The rules specified the correct way to examine the tea bowl, holding it in both hands, turning it so that the front of the bowl, the most beautiful part, was not placed to the mouth, an act of aesthetic consideration that was also an act of moral humility. The rules specified the correct way to wipe the bowl, the correct way to replace it, the correct sequence of appreciating the various objects in the tea room, the correct topics of conversation, and the many topics that were not permitted. The tea room itself was subject to rules that expressed the wabi aesthetic. It should be small, it should appear rustic and unadorned. The materials should appear natural and unworked. The objects chosen for display should be chosen for their capacity to evoke the aesthetic of impermanence and incompleteness that wabi required. A bowl that was slightly irregular, that showed the marks of the craftsman's hand, that was asymmetrical in its beauty, was more appropriate to the tea ceremony than a bowl of perfect regularity, because the perfect bowl suggested the permanence and completeness that the wabi aesthetic was specifically turning away from. The rules of the tea ceremony were therefore not rules about how to make tea correctly. They were rules about how to inhabit a specific philosophical understanding of the nature of beauty and the nature of human experience, enacted through the medium of the most ordinary domestic activity, the preparation and consumption of a hot beverage. That the Japanese tradition produced this transformation of tea preparation into philosophical practice is one of the more remarkable achievements of any culture in producing meaning from everyday activity, and it was accomplished through the application of rules so specific and so seriously observed that the rules themselves became the vehicle of the philosophical content they were designed to express. But China and Japan have more to offer before we leave them, and the Mongol Empire that connected them to the rest of the world deserves its own extended treatment, because the Mongols produced one of the most paradoxical and most consequential civilizations in the history of the world. A civilization that destroyed more than perhaps any other in recorded history, and that simultaneously created the conditions for one of the greatest periods of cross-cultural exchange and economic prosperity that the pre-modern world ever experienced. A civilization whose rules were simultaneously brutal beyond any modern standard and sophisticated beyond what most people expect when they think about a society organized around the capacity for conquest. But before we arrive at the Mongols, there are more rules in the Chinese tradition that deserve attention, rules that we touched on briefly in the block anterior, but that require more careful examination to fully understand. Because the Tang dynasty that succeeded the Han was not simply a continuation of what came before. It was a transformation of the Chinese imperial tradition that produced some of the most interesting and most revealing rules in the entire corpus of Chinese governance. The Tang dynasty examination system, which we encountered briefly before, had by the 7th century of our era become the most elaborate and most consequential examination system in the world, and the rules governing it had developed a specificity and a sophistication that the Han prototype had only suggested. The examination was now genuinely open in principle to any male subject of the empire regardless of his birth. In practice, the preparation required years of study under qualified teachers and access to the classical texts and commentaries that no poor family could afford without outside assistance. But the principle was real, and its practical expression, however imperfect, produced a governing class that was considerably more meritocratic than anything that Europe or the Islamic world or any other contemporary civilization was producing. The examinations themselves had become elaborate in their structure. There were multiple levels, from the local examinations conducted in the prefectures, to the metropolitan examinations in the capital, to the palace examinations conducted in the presence of the emperor himself. Each level filtered the candidates further, with successful candidates at each level gaining specific titles and specific rights that distinguished them from those who had passed lower levels or failed higher ones. The Jinshi degree, the top level, was extraordinarily difficult to obtain, and those who obtained it joined a specific social category with specific privileges and specific expectations that shaped their entire subsequent careers. The specific content of the Tang examinations reveals what the Chinese state believed governance required. The classical texts, which had been the core of the curriculum since the Han, remained central, but the Tang examinations added poetry composition as a major component, and the specific forms of regulated verse that candidates were required to compose, the Lushi and the Joju, with their strict requirements of tonal patterns, parallel grammatical structures, and specific rhyme schemes, were among the most technically demanding forms of literary production that any examination system in history has required of its candidates. A candidate who could compose a technically perfect Lushi on a specified topic in a specified time was demonstrating not just literary skill, but a kind of mental agility and a kind of trained attention to form and pattern that the Chinese tradition associated with the qualities needed for sound governance. The rules about what constituted a good examination essay in the Tang reveal a specific theory of intellectual excellence that was different from the theories of intellectual excellence that other traditions emphasized. A good examination essay was not primarily a display of independent analytical reasoning, of the candidate's personal insights into the problems being addressed. It was a demonstration of the candidate's thorough understanding of the classical tradition, of his ability to bring the wisdom of the sages to bear on the specific questions posed, and of his capacity to express that wisdom in language of appropriate elegance and precision. The candidate who displayed too much independent reasoning, who deviated too far from the frameworks of the established tradition, was a candidate who was demonstrating bad judgment as much as intellectual originality. The tradition was right. The candidate's job was to understand it thoroughly and apply it skillfully, not to replace it with his own innovations. This theory of intellectual excellence had consequences that extended well beyond the examination hall. It shaped the entire intellectual culture of Tang China in ways that were simultaneously strengths and limitations. The strength was that it produced officials who shared a common intellectual framework, who could communicate across the vast distances of the empire using a shared vocabulary and a shared set of references, and who brought their administrative work a training in the application of accumulated wisdom that was genuinely valuable. The limitation was that it created institutional pressure against intellectual innovation, against the questioning of established frameworks, against precisely the kind of independent reasoning that might produce genuinely new solutions to new problems. The rules about how Tang officials communicated with each other and with the court reveal a bureaucratic system of extraordinary sophistication. The memorial, the formal document through which officials communicated with the emperor, was a highly regulated form with specific requirements for format, language, and content that distinguished it from all other forms of written communication. The rules about which officials could submit memorials directly to the emperor, which had to go through intermediaries, and which categories of content required which levels of classification and review, were specified in the Tang legal code and enforced by the secretariat that managed the flow of documents to and from the throne. The rules about the handling of imperial rescripts, the emperor's formal responses to memorials, were equally elaborate. A rescript that authorized a particular action was a document of enormous legal and practical significance, and the rules about how it was to be transmitted, recorded, stored, and implemented were specified in detail. The official who acted on the basis of a forged rescript was not simply committing a fraud. He was disrupting the entire chain of legitimate authority that connected imperial will to administrative action, which in the Confucian framework was a form of cosmic disorder with consequences that went beyond the specific act. The Tang dynasty rules about foreigners and the management of the cosmopolitan diversity that made Chang'an one of the great cities of the medieval world reveal a state that was simultaneously confident enough in its own cultural superiority to be genuinely curious about foreign cultures and sophisticated enough to manage that diversity with a regulatory framework that allowed the diversity to flourish while maintaining Chinese cultural dominance. The system of designated wards for foreign communities, the guest houses maintained by the state for foreign merchants and diplomats, the translators provided by the court for official communication with foreign representatives, and the regulations governing what foreign merchants could and could not do in the capital, all reflected a sophisticated understanding that managing foreigners required specific institutional mechanisms rather than either simple exclusion or simple absorption. The rules about the Silk Road trade that brought foreigners to Chang'an in large numbers were organized around a combination of state interest in the revenues that trade generated and Confucian ambivalence about commercial activity as such. The Tang state collected substantial revenues from the taxes on Silk Road trade, from the customs duties paid at the passes through which goods entered and left the empire, and from the fees charged at the designated marketplaces where foreign and domestic merchants conducted their business. The rules governing these revenues were specified in the Tang legal code and enforced by a system of customs officials whose responsibilities combined the collection of revenue with the prevention of the smuggling of goods whose export was prohibited. The list of prohibited exports reveals what the Tang state considered its most strategically valuable assets. Silk was prohibited from export in raw form for certain periods because the silk weaving technology that transformed raw fiber into the finished product was a source of competitive advantage that the Tang government was reluctant to share with the civilizations beyond its borders. Iron was restricted because iron could be made into weapons that might be used against the empire. Books containing specific categories of technical or strategic information were restricted because the knowledge they contained was understood to have military or strategic value. The prohibition on exporting silk production technology was ultimately unsuccessful. The secret of silk production had been smuggled to Byzantium by monks who concealed silkworm eggs in hollow canes in the 6th century, before the Tang period. But the principle of controlling the export of strategically valuable knowledge through trade regulation is one that the Tang state pursued with considerable sophistication. The rules about Chinese poetry and its role in official life reveal a dimension of Tang culture that has no equivalent in any other bureaucratic tradition. In Tang China, a high official who could not write good poetry was a man whose fitness for his position was genuinely in question, not because poetry was a separate accomplishment that demonstrated cultivation, but because poetry and governance were understood to draw on the same fundamental capacity for perceiving and expressing the moral order of the universe. The examination had tested poetry. The social life of the court and the bureaucracy was organized around the composition and exchange of poetry at banquets and festivals, and in the personal correspondence that officials maintained with each other. A minister who was summoned to a banquet at which the emperor proposed a poetic topic for improvised composition, and who could not produce a creditable poem, was not simply failing a social test. He was demonstrating that the fundamental cultivation that his position required was not fully present. The specific forms of regulated Tang verse were more demanding than anything in the Western poetic tradition. The Lushi required 8 lines of 5 or 7 characters each, with a specific tonal pattern governing each character. Specific requirements for grammatical parallelism between the second and third couplets, and a specific rhyme scheme. The tonal requirements alone made the form extraordinarily difficult because the Chinese language has tones that are phonemic, that change the meaning of a syllable depending on whether it is rising, falling, level, or entering, and the correct arrangement of tones within the Lushi required simultaneous attention to meaning, grammar, imagery, tonal pattern, and rhyme scheme in a way that demanded a kind of multiple-track mental processing that no other poetic form in the world required to the same degree. A Tang official who could produce a technically perfect Lushi spontaneously on a proposed topic at a court banquet was demonstrating the kind of mind that the Chinese tradition associated with the capacity for sound governance, the mind that could hold multiple considerations simultaneously, that could perceive pattern in complexity, that could produce the harmonious resolution of competing requirements in a single elegant expression. The parallel between the requirements of regulated verse and the requirements of administrative decision-making was not accidental or metaphorical. It was the expression of a theory that both activities drew on the same fundamental cognitive and moral capacities. Now let us cross the steppe and meet the most consequential conquering force that the ancient and medieval world produced, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors. And let us do so without the simplification that the popular image of the Mongols as simple destroyers invites, because the Mongols were not simple anything. They were complex, contradictory, pragmatic, and in their own specific way deeply principled, with a set of rules that reflected a coherent and internally consistent understanding of how the world worked and how it should be organized. Temujin, the man who became Genghis Khan, was born around 1162 in the steppe north of what is now the Chinese border into a world of constant intertribal conflict in which alliances were fluid, loyalties were temporary, and survival required a combination of military skill, political intelligence, and the ability to build the kind of personal network that could be mobilized when the inevitable crisis arrived. His childhood was marked by the kidnapping of his father by a rival tribe who poisoned him when Temujin was 9, and the subsequent abandonment of his family by their own tribal allies who refused to support a widow and her children after the loss of the family's patriarch. These experiences shaped the man who would eventually unite the Mongol tribes and conquer the largest contiguous empire in history in ways that are directly visible in the rules he established for governing that empire. The first and most fundamental rule of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan was the rule of absolute loyalty. Not loyalty to a tribe or a lineage or a tradition, but personal loyalty to Genghis Khan himself, expressed through the institution of the Nokod, the companions who were bound to him personally rather than through the traditional structures of steppe politics. The breakdown of traditional tribal loyalty that Temujin had experienced as a child had taught him that traditional structures were unreliable and that the only loyalty that could be depended on was personal loyalty built through shared experience and mutual obligation. The no-code system was the institutionalization of that lesson. Men who entered the no-code bound themselves to Genghis Khan personally, received his protection and his patronage in return, and were expected to demonstrate their loyalty not through the conventional obligations of tribal membership, but through personal service and personal sacrifice. The rules governing the no-code were specific about what loyalty required, and what it provided in return. A no-code who failed his leader in a moment of crisis was not simply failing a conventional obligation. He was violating the personal bond that was the foundation of the entire Mongol political structure. The punishment for such a violation was death, and it was applied consistently and publicly as a demonstration that the rules were real and that the bond was genuine. Conversely, a no-code who distinguished himself in service to Genghis Khan received rewards that went beyond the conventional patterns of steppe patronage, including access to conquered wealth, administrative positions in the new empire, and the social elevation that proximity to the most powerful man in the world provided. The Yasa, the great law code of Genghis Khan, is one of the most discussed and least understood documents in Mongolian history. The original text has not survived, and what we know of its contents comes from secondary sources of varying reliability. But the principles that can be reconstructed from these sources reveal a legal system that was organized around the specific problems of governing a nomadic confederation that was rapidly transforming itself into a sedentary empire, and that reflected the practical wisdom accumulated over generations of steppe experience rather than the philosophical frameworks of any literate tradition. The Yasa's prohibition on the theft of animals reflected the most fundamental source of conflict in steppe society. Herds were the primary form of wealth in the nomadic economy, and the raiding of rival herds had been the primary mechanism of wealth redistribution for generations. By making animal theft a capital offense, Genghis Khan was not simply enforcing a conventional property right. He was attacking the very foundation of the intertribal conflict that had kept the Mongolian steppe in a state of constant warfare. The unification of the Mongol tribes required the suppression of the raiding economy that had sustained that warfare, and the rules of the Yasa were the instruments of that suppression. The Yasa's rules about water were equally revealing of the specific environmental conditions of steppe life. The prohibition on washing in running water during thunderstorms was not simply a superstition about lightning. It reflected the profound importance of water sources in an environment where fresh water was scarce, and where the contamination of a river or a spring could threaten the survival of an entire community. The rules about water purity in the Yasa were the practical expression of centuries of experience with the consequences of contaminating the water sources that nomadic life depended on, expressed in a form that combined religious sanction with practical prohibition in the same way that the Zoroastrian water purity rules had done in a different environmental context. The Mongol rule about the treatment of envoys was one of the most consequential and most consistently applied rules in the Yasa. Envoys were inviolable. An envoy could travel anywhere in the Mongol Empire without being harmed, regardless of whether the polity he represented was at war with the Mongols or at peace. This rule was not simply diplomatic courtesy. It was a practical necessity for the management of an empire whose communications depended on the ability of messengers to travel safely across vast distances and hostile territories. But it was also a rule whose violation carried the most severe consequences the Mongol system could impose. The polity that killed or mistreated a Mongol envoy had declared itself outside the framework of civilized relations, and could expect a response whose scale was designed to ensure that no polity would ever make that mistake again. The Khwarezmian Empire's execution of the Mongol trade envoy in 1218 is perhaps the most consequential diplomatic murder in history. The Shah of Khwarezm, who controlled much of Central Asia and Persia, decided that the Mongol merchants accompanying the envoy were actually spies, had them killed along with the envoy, and apparently believed that the geographical distance between Khwarezm and Mongolia was sufficient protection against whatever response the Mongols might consider. He was wrong in a way that reshaped the civilization of Central Asia for centuries. The Mongol response to the murder of the envoy was not simply a punitive raid. It was the systematic destruction of the most prosperous urban civilization in the Islamic world. The sacking of Samarkand and Bukhara and Merv and Nishapur and dozens of other cities that had been among the greatest centers of scholarship, commerce and culture in the medieval world. The rule about envoy inviolability was not simply stated. It was demonstrated through the most comprehensive enforcement action that the steppe world had ever produced. The Mongol rules about religious tolerance were among the most sophisticated and most genuinely unusual in the medieval world, and they produced consequences that are still shaping the religious geography of Asia today. The Yasa's provisions exempting religious leaders of all faiths from taxation and from military service were not primarily motivated by theological conviction about the equality of religions. They were motivated by the practical understanding that religious leaders exercised a form of authority over their communities that the Mongol administrative system could not easily replicate through its own mechanisms, and that the most efficient way to manage that authority was to incorporate it into the imperial system rather than to suppress it and create the resistance that suppression would generate. The result was that the Mongol Empire became the scene of one of the most remarkable experiments in religious pluralism that the medieval world produced. The court of Genghis Khan's successors included Buddhist monks and Nestorian Christian priests, and Muslim imams and Taoist scholars, all competing for imperial patronage and all finding at least occasional success in that competition. The Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, sent as an envoy by King Louis IX of France to the court of the great Khan Moncur in 1253, was astonished to find a court in which he encountered representatives of virtually every religion known to medieval Europe, and several that were not, all tolerated, and many patronized by a ruler whose own religious allegiance was somewhat eclectic and primarily practical. The Mongol rules about the census and the decimal military organization reveal an administrative sophistication that is surprising in an organization that is primarily remembered for its destructive capacity. The census that the Mongols conducted in every territory they conquered was not simply a counting exercise. It was a comprehensive assessment of the productive capacity of the conquered population, identifying the human and material resources that could be mobilized for the purposes of the empire. The information gathered in the census about the population's size and composition, about the agricultural land and its productivity, about the craftsmen and their skills, about the merchants and their trade networks, was the foundation on which the Mongol administrative and fiscal systems were built. The decimal organization that divided the Mongol military into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with its own commander responsible for the unit's performance and discipline, was one of the most effective military organizational structures that the pre-modern world produced. The principle was simple. Every soldier belonged to a specific unit. Every unit had a specific commander. Every commander was personally responsible for the behavior and performance of every person under his command, and the consequences for failure were severe and consistently applied. The simplicity of the principle and the consistency of its application produced a military machine whose flexibility, speed, and coordination overwhelmed every opponent it encountered for the better part of a century. The rules about promotion and reward in the Mongol military system were organized around demonstrated performance rather than birth or seniority, in a way that was unusual for a society that had been organized around hereditary tribal leadership for generations. A man who showed exceptional courage in battle, who demonstrated exceptional ability in the management of his unit, who showed exceptional judgment in a crisis, could be promoted regardless of his birth or his previous standing. Conversely, a commander who failed in his responsibilities, whose unit performed poorly, who showed poor judgment in a critical situation, could be demoted or executed regardless of his rank or his family connections. The system created powerful incentives for performance and powerful disincentives for the kind of comfortable incompetence that hereditary rank systems tended to produce. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, that followed the completion of the conquests in the mid-13th century was one of the most remarkable periods of cross-cultural exchange in the pre-modern world. The rules that made it possible were essentially the rules of commercial facilitation, the maintenance of the safety of the trade routes, the enforcement of the contracts between merchants of different cultural backgrounds, the provision of the infrastructure of relay stations and caravanserais that allowed goods and information to move across the full width of Eurasia with a speed and a reliability that the fragmented political world before the Mongol conquests had not permitted. The specific rules about the conduct of trade under Mongol protection were enforced through the autarch system, the partnership arrangement between Mongol overlords and merchant partners that was the primary commercial institution of the Mongol Empire. Under the autarch system, Mongol nobles invested capital with merchant partners who used it to conduct trade on their behalf, sharing the profits with the noble investors while bearing the risks of the trade themselves. The rules about the autarch relationship specified the obligations of both parties, the share of profits owed to the investor, the protections provided to the merchant while travelling under Mongol protection, and the consequences for violations of the agreement by either party. The autarch system was not simply a commercial arrangement. It was the mechanism by which the Mongol ruling class participated in the commercial economy that their conquests had opened up without engaging in commercial activity directly, which would have been beneath the dignity of the warrior aristocracy. The rules of the autarch allowed the Mongols to extract commercial wealth through partnership rather than through the more direct mechanisms of taxation and tribute, creating an alignment of interests between the Mongol ruling class and the merchant communities that was one of the foundations of the commercial prosperity of the Pax Mongolica period. The rules about the yam, the Mongol postal relay system, were among the most practically consequential in the entire Mongol administrative framework. The yam consisted of a network of relay stations distributed across the empire at intervals of approximately 30 kilometers. Each station maintaining a supply of horses, food, and accommodation for official travelers bearing the appropriate credentials. A messenger carrying imperial dispatches could travel from one end of the empire to the other at speeds that were genuinely extraordinary for the period, changing horses at each relay station and continuing without significant rest until the message reached its destination. Marco Polo's account of the yam, which he encountered during his years in Kublai Khan's service in the late 13th century, described a system that he estimated maintained over 10,000 relay stations and 200,000 horses in operation simultaneously. His numbers may be exaggerated, but the system was genuinely impressive. The speed of communication that it provided was one of the key advantages that allowed the Mongol Empire to function as an administrative unit despite its enormous size. An order issued in Karakorum could reach the governors of Persia, of China, and of Russia within days rather than weeks or months, giving the central administration a degree of control over its distant provinces that would have been impossible without the yam infrastructure. The rules about who could use the yam and what credentials they needed to do so were carefully specified. A traveller without the appropriate authorization, the girej or paisi, the bronze or silver tablet that served as an imperial passport, could not claim the services of the relay stations. A traveller who forged such credentials was committing a capital offence. The system was designed for official use, for the communication of imperial orders and the movement of imperial representatives, and the rules about access were designed to prevent the system from being overwhelmed by unofficial travellers, while ensuring that those with legitimate needs could use it with maximum efficiency. The Mongol rules about the treatment of conquered peoples after the initial conquest reflect a pragmatism that is at odds with the image of pure destruction that the conquest period created. Once a territory had been subdued, the Mongols had a strong interest in its recovery and productivity, because a destroyed territory could not pay taxes, could not supply soldiers, and could not contribute to the commercial prosperity of the Pax Mongolica. The rules about the post-conquest administration of conquered territories therefore provided for the restoration of productive capacity, through a combination of the reduction of tax burdens that had been oppressive under previous rulers, the protection of merchants and craftsmen whose skills were economically valuable, and the employment of local administrative expertise in the management of the conquered territory. The Mongol practice of employing the administrative personnel of conquered states in the continuing administration of those states under Mongol overlordship was one of the most important features of their imperial system. Chinese officials administered China under Mongol supervision. Persian officials administered Persia. The Mongols provided the military backbone and the ultimate political authority. The conquered peoples provided the administrative expertise that the Mongols themselves did not possess. The rules about the relationship between Mongol overlords and local administrators specified the obligations of each party in considerable detail, including the protections that local administrators received in exchange for their cooperation, and the consequences for those who attempted to exploit their administrative position to undermine Mongol authority. The rules about succession in the Mongol Empire were among the most consequential and least successfully resolved problems that the Mongol political system produced. Genghis Khan's own solution to the succession problem, the division of the empire among his sons while maintaining the concept of a paramount great Khan, to whom all the subordinate Khans owed ultimate allegiance, was both politically necessary, because the steppe tradition of sharing wealth among the conqueror's sons could not simply be set aside, and institutionally precarious, because the division of military and economic resources among multiple heirs created the conditions for the fragmentation that eventually destroyed the unity of the empire. The Kurultai, the great assembly of Mongol nobles at which the new great Khan was elected by acclamation of the assembled leadership, was the institutional mechanism for managing succession, and its rules were elaborate in their requirements for attendance, for the deliberative process, and for the form of the acclamation that confirmed the choice. But the Kurultai's rules could not resolve the fundamental problem that the Mongol system of divided inheritance created, which was that any of Genghis Khan's descendants had a legitimate claim to a share of the imperial inheritance, and that when the shares were large enough and the claimants numerous enough, the competition for the position of Great Khan inevitably produced the military conflict that destroyed the administrative unity that the Yam and the census and the Ortak had created. The division of the Mongol Empire into the four successor Khanates of the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the Russian steppe, was not simply a political development. It was the institutional expression of the failure to resolve the succession problem that the rules of the Mongol system had created. Each of the successor Khanates developed in different directions, absorbing the cultural influences of the territories they controlled, converting to the dominant religion of those territories, adopting the administrative practices of the sedentary civilizations they governed, and eventually ceasing to be recognizably Mongol in anything except their ruling lineage. The Ilkhanate in Persia converted to Islam. The Golden Horde converted to Islam. The Yuan dynasty in China adopted the forms of Chinese imperial governance while maintaining a degree of Mongol cultural distinctiveness in its ruling class. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented into competing factions that never achieved the administrative coherence of the other successor states. Each of these trajectories was shaped by the rules of the Mongol system as much as by the cultures of the conquered territories, because the Mongol rules about religious tolerance had created the conditions for conversion, the rules about administrative pragmatism had created the conditions for cultural absorption, and the rules about succession had created the conditions for fragmentation. The legacy of the Mongol Empire is therefore not simply the legacy of destruction. Though the destruction was real and vast, it is also the legacy of the Pax Mongolica, of the period of cross-cultural exchange and commercial prosperity that the Mongol rules about trade facilitation and route safety made possible. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the mid-14th century travelled along the trade routes that the Pax Mongolica had opened, a grim reminder that the rules that facilitated the movement of goods and people also facilitated the movement of disease. But the paper money technology that Europe eventually adopted came from China via the Mongol commercial networks. The astronomical knowledge that the Islamic world transmitted to Europe travelled partly through the same channels. The understanding of Asian geography that eventually motivated the European age of exploration was built on the accounts of travellers who crossed Eurasia under the protection of the Mongol rules about the safety of commerce and diplomacy. The rules of the Mongol Empire were strange in ways that reflected the specific strangeness of a civilization that had been formed on the steppe, and then suddenly found itself governing the majority of the known world. They were brutal in ways that reflected the specific brutality of the conquest tradition from which they emerged. They were sophisticated in ways that reflected the pragmatic intelligence of a leadership class that understood that governing an empire required different tools than conquering one. And they were consequential in ways that shaped the subsequent history of the world more profoundly than almost any other single set of rules that the pre-modern world produced. Now as the night deepens and the history of China and Japan and the Mongol world recedes into the comfortable distance that sleep requires, let us take a moment to consider what connects all of these extraordinary rules that we have visited tonight. The Han official who resigned his post to mourn his father for 25 months. The Tang examination candidate who memorized thousands of lines of classical poetry and composed regulated verse in a form that required simultaneous attention to meaning, grammar, imagery, tone, and rhyme. The samurai who composed a death poem in the moments before seppuku. The Mongol envoy whose inviolability was enforced through the destruction of an entire civilization. The Tang Empress who ruled China for decades by finding the frameworks within which female authority could be legitimate. All of them were living inside systems of rules that were simultaneously constraints on individual freedom and the conditions of individual possibility. The Han official who mourned correctly was not simply following rules. He was participating in the maintenance of the social fabric that made the civilization he served possible. The Tang examination candidate who passed the Jinshi was not simply demonstrating individual achievement. He was becoming a node in the administrative network that kept 50 million people fed, governed, and protected across a territory that dwarfed anything the Roman Empire had managed. The samurai who died well was not simply performing a cultural script. He was embodying the values that made the warrior class comprehensible to itself as something more than organized violence. The rules were the civilization, not the buildings, not the art, not the technological achievements, though all of these were real and remarkable. The rules were the medium through which the accumulated wisdom and the accumulated anxiety and the accumulated aspiration of each of these cultures expressed itself in the conduct of daily life. The Han officials' mourning garments were the Confucian theory of filial piety made visible. The Tang examination candidate's regulated verse was the Chinese theory of governance expressed in aesthetic form. The samurai's death poem was the Japanese theory of impermanence enacted at the moment of maximum personal immediacy. The Mongol envoys' inviolability was the steppe theory of political relationship expressed through the most severe possible enforcement mechanism. Understanding the rules is understanding the civilization. Not because the rules were always followed, because they were not, and not because the rules were always just, because they were not, and not because the rules always achieved what they were designed to achieve, because they frequently did not, but because the rules were the most direct available expression of what each civilization believed about the nature of the world, the nature of human beings, and the nature of the relationship between them that made social life possible and worth living. The Han dynasty lasted 4 centuries. The Tang dynasty lasted 3. The samurai tradition persisted in recognizable form for nearly 1,000 years. The Mongol Empire in its original form lasted less than a century before fragmenting into its successor states. The duration of each civilization was not determined by the sophistication of its rules alone. It was determined by the combination of the rules and the conditions and the contingencies and the accidents that shaped the specific history of each. But the rules were always part of the story, always shaping what was possible and what was not, always expressing what the civilization believed and what it feared, always creating the conditions in which the human beings who lived under them had to find their way through the specific world that the rules had made. And now the night has run its course through China and Japan and the Mongol steppe, through mourning rules and examination rules and sword rules and envoy rules and tea ceremony rules and yam relay rules, and all of these extraordinary people in their extraordinary circumstances are resting in the history that contains them. The Han official has completed his 25 months of mourning and returned to his post. The Tang examination candidate has composed his final regulated verse and laid down his brush. The samurai has written his death poem and found in it the equanimity that the tradition required. The Mongol envoy is travelling safely across the steppe under the protection of the rules that guaranteed his inviolability. They were human, every one of them, in the specific way that their specific civilization had shaped them to be human, with the specific possibilities and the specific limitations that their rules had created. Their humanity was not less than ours, their rules were not simpler than ours, their world was not smaller than ours. It was different, profoundly and fascinatingly different, and that difference is what we come to history to find. Sleep well. China and Japan and the Great Steppe are quiet now. The examinations are over for tonight. The tea ceremony has concluded. The yam relay has carried its last message of the night. And the extraordinary rules that shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people across 1,000 years of history have done their work for this evening. Rest now. The rules will wait until morning, but the night has more to offer. Because we have spent time in China and Japan and the Mongol steppe, and we have barely begun to exhaust what those civilizations produced in terms of extraordinary rules that reveal extraordinary thinking. Tonight we continue with dimensions of the Chinese and Japanese traditions that we have not yet examined, and then we turn to the civilization that most people in the Western tradition know least well, despite its extraordinary sophistication. The civilization of the Indian subcontinent under the Maurya and Gupta empires, whose rules about governance, about social organization, about the relationship between the state and the individual, and about the nature of the good life, produced some of the most original and most consequential thinking in the ancient world. And we end with the civilization of the Maya, whose rules about time and about the cosmos and about the relationship between human beings and the divine produced one of the most elaborate and most fascinating intellectual systems that any pre-modern culture anywhere in the world ever constructed. But first, more China. Because the Song dynasty which succeeded the Tang and which lasted from 960 to 1279 produced a set of rules and a set of social conditions that in some ways represent the highest achievement of Chinese civilization, and that deserve examination in their own right rather than simply as a continuation of what came before. The Song dynasty is the period in which Chinese civilization produced its most sustained and most impressive efflorescence of scientific and technological innovation, and the rules that governed that innovation, or more precisely the rules that failed to prevent it and in some ways actively encouraged it, are as interesting as any of the more conventionally regulatory rules we have examined. The Song period produced gunpowder weapons, printing with movable type, the magnetic compass for navigation, paper money, sophisticated hydraulic engineering, advances in agricultural technology, including new strains of rice that dramatically increased yields, and a commercial economy of sufficient sophistication that some economic historians have argued that the Song dynasty was on the verge of an industrial revolution 6 centuries before the one that actually occurred in England. The rules that made this possible were in significant measure negative rules about what the state did not prohibit rather than rules about what it actively promoted. The Song state was more commercially tolerant than the Tang, more willing to allow the development of private commercial enterprise without imposing the kind of state oversight that would have stifled the commercial dynamism that produced Song prosperity. The rules about commerce in the Song dynasty were organized around the extraction of revenue from commercial activity through taxation, rather than the Confucian ambivalence about commerce that had characterized earlier periods, and the result was a commercial sector of sufficient size and sophistication to sustain the technological development that the Song period produced. The rules about printing in the Song dynasty reveal a fascinating case in which a technological innovation created social consequences that the existing rules were not designed to manage, and that required the development of new regulatory frameworks in response. The movable type printing technology developed by Bi Sheng in the 11th century made the mass reproduction of texts possible for the first time in Chinese history, and the consequences for the examination system, for the transmission of knowledge, for the formation of public opinion, and for the organization of intellectual life were enormous and largely unanticipated. Before printing, texts were expensive and scarce. A scholar who wanted access to the classical texts needed either the wealth to commission hand-copied manuscripts, or access to an institutional library of the kind maintained by the great monasteries and official schools. The examination system's requirement of mastery of the classical texts was therefore in practice a requirement that candidates had access to social networks and institutional resources that made the texts available. After printing, the texts became cheap and widely available. A scholar in a provincial city could accumulate a working library of the classical texts and their major commentaries for a fraction of what it had previously cost. The democratizing effect on access to the knowledge tested by the examination was significant and real, but printing also made possible the circulation of texts that were not the approved classics and their approved commentaries, texts that offered alternative interpretations of the classical tradition, texts that circulated news and opinion about current events, texts that contained technical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and engineering that had previously been transmitted through restricted channels. The rules about what could be printed and what could not were developed in response to the social consequences of printing technology, and they reveal the same tension between the state's desire to control the flow of information and the population's desire for access to knowledge that printing technology has created in every society where it has been introduced. The Song dynasty rules about Neo-Confucianism reveal how a philosophical movement can become an instrument of social control while simultaneously genuinely believing itself to be a pursuit of truth. Neo-Confucianism, the philosophical synthesis developed by Zhu Xi and his predecessors and successors in the Song period, was an attempt to respond to the challenge that Buddhism and Taoism posed to the Confucian tradition by developing a more comprehensive metaphysical framework that could address the questions about the nature of ultimate reality and the place of human beings in the cosmos that the original Confucian texts had not systematically engaged. The Neo-Confucian synthesis was genuinely intellectually impressive. It produced a coherent account of the relationship between principle Li and material force Qi that organized the entire natural and human world within a single explanatory framework. It developed a sophisticated account of moral cultivation that connected the investigation of things in the external world with the cultivation of moral knowledge in the internal world of the mind. It provided a philosophical foundation for the examination system by arguing that the mastery of the classical texts was not simply an academic exercise, but a path to the understanding of the principles that governed the universe. But the rules about which philosophical frameworks were acceptable in the examination system were rules about ideological conformity as much as rules about intellectual quality. Once Neo-Confucianism became the official orthodoxy of the examination system in the late Song and early Ming, the rules effectively required that candidates demonstrate their mastery of Zhu Ci's specific interpretations of the classical texts, rather than offering their own independent readings. The examination had always been somewhat conservative in its intellectual requirements, but the codification of Neo-Confucian orthodoxy made it specifically hostile to intellectual innovation in ways that the Tang examination, with its emphasis on poetry composition and its relative openness about classical interpretation, had not been. The rules about the eight-legged essay, the Baguan, that became the required form for examination essays in the Ming Dynasty, represent the most extreme expression of the formalism that the examination system tended toward when the pressures of mass testing and standardized grading were allowed to dominate the design of the examination. The eight-legged essay required the candidate to develop a prescribed topic from the classical texts through 8 specific structural sections, each with a specific function and a specific relationship to the others, in a form so rigid and so precisely specified that the essay's formal structure was as demanding as the content it was supposed to convey. The rules of the eight-legged essay specified the length of each section, the relationship between the sections, the specific linguistic forms that different parts of the essay should use, and the overall balance of the composition. A candidate who had mastered the form could produce a technically correct eight-legged essay on almost any classical topic without necessarily having anything particularly original or insightful to say about it. And the rules of the examination grading system, which required examiners to grade thousands of essays quickly and consistently, created pressure toward the mechanical application of formal criteria rather than the assessment of genuine intellectual quality. The rules of the eight-legged essay are sometimes cited as evidence of the intellectual sterility of the late imperial Chinese examination system, and there is truth in that critique. But they are also evidence of something more interesting, which is the general tendency of any rule system that must be applied at scale to develop toward formal criteria that can be consistently assessed, rather than substantive criteria that require individual judgment. The same tendency is visible in every modern examination system, in the standardized tests and the rubric-graded essays, and the multiple-choice questions that measure what can be measured rather than what actually matters. And the Song and Ming rules about examination form are an early and unusually explicit version of a problem that every society that has tried to use examinations to allocate social positions has eventually encountered. The Song dynasty rules about women and the foot-binding practice reveal one of the most disturbing and most revealing examples of how aesthetic rules can become instruments of social control and how social control can become internalized as aesthetic preference in ways that make the original coercive dimension invisible. Foot binding, the practice of tightly wrapping the feet of young girls to prevent normal growth and produce the small arched feet that Song elite culture considered beautiful, began in the Tang period among court entertainers and spread during the Song to become a widespread practice among the elite and eventually among large sections of the non-elite population. The rules about foot binding were not initially legal rules enforced by the state. They were social rules enforced by the marriage market. A girl whose feet were not bound was a girl who would have difficulty finding a husband of suitable status because the small bound foot was a marker of the delicacy and restraint that elite female identity in Song China required. The family that failed to bind a daughter's feet was a family that was reducing her marriage prospects and therefore her lifetime social position. The rules were therefore self-enforcing in the most pervasive and most difficult to resist way, through the accumulated social pressure of families making individually rational decisions in a system where the rules about female desirability had been defined in a way that required foot binding for compliance. The physical consequences of foot binding were severe and lifelong. The process of binding began when girls were between 4 and 7 years old, when the foot bones were still soft enough to be deformed by the pressure of tight bandages. The 4 smaller toes were bent under the sole of the foot and bound tightly, with the binding gradually tightened over months and years until the foot reached the desired shape. The process was extremely painful, frequently caused infections, and permanently impaired the ability to walk normally. Women with bound feet could walk, but only with a shuffling gait that made any sustained physical activity difficult, and that required careful attention to balance on surfaces that were not flat and level. The aesthetic appreciation of the bound foot in Song elite culture was genuine and elaborately developed. There was a literature of bound foot appreciation, with specific categories of the ideal shape, and specific terms for the different qualities of the foot that connoisseurs valued. The eroticism of the bound foot in Song male culture was real and extensively documented. The rules about what constituted a beautiful foot were as precisely specified as any other aesthetic rules in the Chinese tradition, with the specific measurements and proportions of the ideal foot debated and refined in the same spirit of aesthetic discrimination that produced the rules about calligraphy and regulated verse and the arrangement of the tea ceremony. The fact that these precise aesthetic rules required the systematic infliction of pain and permanent disability on every female child born into the families that observed them is the most direct possible illustration of the way in which rule systems can produce outcomes that are simultaneously internally coherent, culturally functional, and morally catastrophic. The rules of foot binding were coherent within the aesthetic and social framework that generated them. They were functional in the sense that they effectively marked the social status of the families that practiced them, and they were catastrophic in the suffering they caused to tens of millions of women over the 9 centuries during which the practice persisted. The eventual abolition of foot binding in the early 20th century was accomplished not through the enforcement of legal prohibitions alone, but through the transformation of the aesthetic rules that had made foot binding desirable in the first place. When the small bound foot ceased to be a marker of elite female identity and began to be a marker of backwardness and resistance to modernization, the social rules that had enforced foot binding reversed direction and began to enforce its abandonment with the same pressure that had previously enforced its adoption. The rules changed. The social mechanism by which they were enforced did not. Now let us travel south and west, from China to the Indian subcontinent, to the civilization of the Maurya Empire under Chandragupta and his grandson Ashoka, and then to the Gupta Empire that succeeded it, and find the extraordinary rules that these civilizations produced for organizing the most complex social hierarchy the ancient world developed, and for governing it with a sophistication that has never been fully appreciated in the Western tradition. The Arthashastra, the treatise on statecraft attributed to Kautilya, the minister who helped Chandragupta Maurya establish his empire in the 4th century before our era, is one of the most remarkable documents of political theory that the ancient world produced. It is more comprehensive, more detailed, and in some ways more ruthlessly realistic than Machiavelli's Prince, which was written 18 centuries later, and to which it is frequently compared. It covers not just the theory of governance, but the specific rules for the administration of every department of state, the management of the king's personal security, the organization of the intelligence service, the regulation of commerce, the management of forests and mines, the rules for the treatment of enemies and allies, and dozens of other topics that the prince treats with philosophical generality, but that the Arthashastra addresses with administrative specificity. The rules about the king's daily schedule in the Arthashastra are worth dwelling on, because they reveal the specific understanding of kingship that Kautilya was articulating. The king's day was divided into specific time periods, each devoted to specific activities. Military exercises and personal security review in the early morning, the reception of petitions and the hearing of intelligence reports from his spies in the late morning, consultations with ministers about matters of state in the afternoon, inspection of the army and the fortifications in the early evening, personal time and religious observances in the later evening. The schedule was not simply a management tool. It was an expression of a theory of kingship in which the king was the instrument through which every function of the state was coordinated, and in which the correct allocation of the king's time was a necessary condition for the correct functioning of the state as a whole. The Arthasastra's rules about the intelligence service are among the most detailed in any ancient political document. Kautilya specified not just the organizational structure of the intelligence service, but the specific techniques by which information was gathered, the specific covers that intelligence agents were to use, the specific methods for testing the loyalty of ministers and officials, and the specific responses that different categories of threat required. The intelligence service was not simply a surveillance mechanism. It was a comprehensive information management system that provided the king with the knowledge he needed to govern effectively, to identify threats before they became crises, and to understand the actual conditions of his kingdom rather than the idealized picture that officials tended to present to those above them. The rules about the treatment of traitors in the Arthashastra were specific and severe. A minister who was discovered to be working against the king's interests was to be eliminated, but the method of elimination was to be calibrated to the specific nature of the threat and the specific political circumstances. Public execution served the purpose of deterrence. Private elimination served the purpose of removing the threat without creating the political complications that public action might generate. The Arthashastra's rules about political assassination were not presented as ethical violations, but as administrative tools, to be used with the same calculation that any other administrative tool required. This is one of the most striking features of the Arthashastra compared to the Confucian tradition we have been examining. The Confucian tradition was deeply concerned with the moral quality of governance, and with the relationship between the ruler's virtue and the effectiveness of his rule. The Arthashastra was concerned with the effectiveness of governance as a practical matter, and while it did not ignore moral considerations entirely, it treated them as one factor among many, rather than as the foundational principle from which everything else derived. The ruler who was morally admirable but politically ineffective was not, in Kautilya's framework, a better ruler than the ruler who was morally questionable but politically effective. The rules of the Arthashastra were rules for effectiveness, and they were honest about what effectiveness in the specific circumstances of ancient Indian politics required. The Maurya Empire under Ashoka, who ruled from approximately 268 to 232 before our era, and who converted to Buddhism after a particularly devastating military campaign, produced a completely different set of rules that were organized around completely different principles. The rock edicts of Ashoka, inscribed on rocks and pillars throughout the empire and preserved in a dozen languages and scripts, are the first large-scale expression in any civilization of what we would now call a philosophy of governance based on the welfare of all subjects, rather than the power of the ruler. The rules that Ashoka's edicts express are rules of Dhamma, the Buddhist concept of righteous conduct, applied to the specific circumstances of imperial governance. The specific rules in Ashoka's edicts covered the treatment of prisoners, who were to be humanely managed and given the opportunity for rehabilitation. They covered the treatment of animals whose slaughter for royal consumption was dramatically reduced as an expression of the Buddhist principle of non-violence, ahimsa. They covered the duties of Ashoka's officials, who were required to travel throughout their territories, rather than remaining in their administrative centres, to listen to the concerns of ordinary people, and to report those concerns to the centre with the same fidelity that they reported the concerns of the powerful. They covered the relationships between different religious communities within the empire, specifying that all were to be respected and that the officials of the state were to refrain from actions that would generate conflict between them. These rules were not simply moral declarations. They were administrative instructions backed by the authority of the empire and enforced through the system of officials and inspectors that the Maurya administrative tradition had developed. An official who failed to treat prisoners humanely was not simply violating a moral principle. He was violating an imperial instruction that had been publicly inscribed and that the officials above him were required to enforce. The innovation of Ashoka's edicts was the transformation of moral principles into administrative rules, the attempt to embed the values of Buddhist Dharma in the daily conduct of imperial governance rather than simply in the personal conduct of the ruler. The rules about the caste system in ancient India are among the most discussed and most contested in any civilization's history, and they require careful treatment that avoids both the oversimplification of pure condemnation and the oversimplification of pure apology. The Varna system, the fourfold division of society into Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, which appears in the Vedic texts of the second millennium before our era, was not simply a system of social hierarchy. It was a cosmological theory of how the different functions necessary to a complex society were organized and why each function required a specific kind of person formed by a specific kind of birth and a specific kind of training. The Brahmin, whose function was the maintenance of the sacred knowledge and the performance of the rituals that maintained the cosmic order, required the specific purity of birth and practice that Brahmin identity specified. The Kshatriya, whose function was the protection of the social order through military force and political authority, required the specific courage and vigour that Kshatriya training was designed to develop. The Vaishya, whose function was the maintenance of the economic life of the community through commerce and agriculture, required the specific skills and temperament that Vaishya hereditary training transmitted. The Shudra, whose function was service to the other three Varnas, required the specific dispositions that service required. The rules about caste interaction, about who could eat with whom, who could touch whom, who could enter which spaces, who could perform which functions, were organized around the concept of ritual purity that was the cosmological foundation of the entire system. Different Varna levels had different levels of ritual purity, and contact between persons of different purity levels was governed by rules designed to prevent the higher purity level from being contaminated by contact with the lower. These rules were as specific and as thoroughly enforced as any rules we have examined in any civilization, and they were enforced not only by legal mechanisms, but by the deep social pressure of a community in which everyone knew everyone else, and in which violation of caste rules had immediate and severe social consequences. The position of the untouchables, those who fell outside the four Varna system entirely because their functions involved contact with substances that were considered ritually impure, death, excrement, leather, was perhaps the most extreme example of social regulation through the mechanism of ritual purity anywhere in the ancient world. The rules about the untouchables specified that they could not walk on public roads that were used by caste Hindus, could not draw water from wells used by caste Hindus, could not enter temples, could not own land in many circumstances, and were required to announce their presence in some places and periods by ringing a bell or clapping to warn caste Hindus of their approach, so that accidental contamination could be avoided. These rules were not the expression of a belief that untouchables were morally inferior. They were the expression of a belief that the functions they performed made them ritually impure in ways that had cosmological consequences for those who came in contact with them. The Gupta Empire that flourished from roughly 320 to 550 of our era produced the golden age of classical Indian civilization, the period in which Sanskrit literature, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and the visual arts reached achievements that influenced the entire subsequent history of Indian and Southeast Asian civilization. The rules about intellectual life in the Gupta period reveal a civilization that combined state patronage of scholarship with a remarkable degree of intellectual freedom in which competing philosophical traditions could engage with each other without the kind of state enforcement of intellectual orthodoxy that characterized the Chinese examination system. The rules about debate and philosophical disputation in the Gupta period were elaborate and seriously observed. Public philosophical debates were major cultural events that could attract large audiences and that were conducted according to specific rules about the forms of valid argument, the categories of evidence that could be cited, the methods of refutation, and the criteria by which a victor could be identified. A philosopher who won a major public debate against a representative of a rival school gained genuine social prestige and practical patronage from rulers and wealthy merchants who found philosophical excellence as impressive as military or commercial excellence. The rules about debate were rules about a competitive intellectual market in which the best arguments won, at least in principle, and in which the circulation of ideas was governed by the quality of the reasoning rather than the authority of the tradition. The mathematical rules developed in the Gupta period include what we now call the Arabic numerals, which are actually Indian in origin, and the concept of zero as a number rather than simply an absence of number, which is one of the most consequential mathematical innovations in history. The rules about the representation of quantity that the Indian mathematicians of the Gupta period developed, the positional decimal notation that allowed any number to be represented using only 10 symbols, were the foundation on which all subsequent mathematics and all subsequent computation have been built. The specific rules about how zero functions in arithmetic, how it interacts with other numbers through addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, were worked out by Indian mathematicians of the 5th and 6th centuries, in a context where mathematics was understood as a branch of cosmological knowledge, as one of the tools through which the structure of the universe could be understood and expressed. The rules about astronomy in the Gupta period were similarly significant. The Indian astronomer Aryabhata, writing in 499 of our era, proposed a model of the solar system in which the Earth rotated on its axis, and the apparent motion of the stars was a consequence of that rotation, rather than of the stars' own movement. He calculated the length of the solar year to a precision that was not matched in Europe until centuries later. He developed trigonometric functions for the calculation of astronomical positions, and he did all of this within a framework that understood astronomical knowledge as both scientifically significant and cosmologically necessary, as a form of understanding the universe that was simultaneously practical in its applications to calendar calculation and navigation, and philosophical in its contribution to the comprehensive account of cosmic order that Indian intellectual tradition was trying to construct. Now we travel to the other side of the world, to the Maya civilization of Mesoamerica, which was simultaneously one of the most isolated and one of the most intellectually sophisticated civilizations that the ancient world produced. The Maya developed, independently of any outside influence, a writing system, a mathematical system, an astronomical knowledge base, and a theory of time that were in several respects more advanced than anything produced by the contemporary civilizations of the Mediterranean world. And the rules that governed their intellectual and social life were organized around a theory of cosmic time that has no equivalent anywhere in the ancient world. The Maya long count calendar, the system for measuring time in absolute terms from a fixed mythological starting point, was the product of a theory of time that understood history not as a linear sequence of events moving from past to future, but as a cyclical pattern in which the same kinds of events recurred at specific intervals determined by the interaction of multiple time cycles. The rules about the calendar were therefore not simply rules about measuring time, they were rules about understanding the nature of historical reality, about knowing where you were in the great cycles of cosmic time and what that meant for the events of the present and the future. The specific cycles that the Maya used to measure time were extraordinarily complex in their interaction. The Tzolk'in, the 260-day ritual calendar, interacted with the Harb, the 365-day solar calendar, to produce the calendar round, a cycle of 52 years after which the two calendars realigned, and which was the fundamental unit of historical time for most purposes in Maya society. The long count extended beyond calendar round to measure time in units of hundreds and thousands of years, allowing the Maya to place specific historical events in a cosmic temporal framework that extended millions of years into the past and future. The rules about the correct interpretation of the calendar were maintained by a class of specialist priests, the day keepers, whose expertise in reading the interaction of the multiple time cycles and interpreting their significance for specific individuals and specific communities was one of the most socially valuable forms of knowledge in Maya society. The rules about which days were auspicious for which activities, which dates were appropriate for which ceremonies, which periods were governed by which supernatural forces, and what those forces required of the human communities living through them, were as specific and as seriously observed as the Egyptian hemorrhagical rules, or the Aztec tonal pohoali, but organized around a more complex mathematical framework than either. The Maya rules about bloodletting and sacrifice reveal the cosmological theory that connected human action to cosmic maintenance in ways that parallel the Egyptian and Aztec theories we have examined, but that have specific characteristics that reflect the specific Maya understanding of the relationship between the human and the divine. The Maya cosmos was sustained by the blood of its inhabitants in a way that was understood as a form of reciprocity with the divine forces that had created human beings from their own blood and sacrifice. The bloodletting rituals that Maya rulers performed at specific points in the ceremonial calendar were not expressions of masochism or cruelty. They were performances of the debt that human beings owed to the divine order for their existence, and acted through the most direct possible means of transferring vital substance from the human world to the divine one. The rules about who performed these rituals, what instruments were used, what parts of the body were involved, and what the ritual context required, were specified in elaborate detail in the screenfold books that the Maya used to record religious and astronomical knowledge. The Maya ruler's bloodletting was particularly important because the ruler was understood as the primary mediator between the human and the divine, and his blood was the most efficacious substance available for maintaining the cosmic order. The rules about royal bloodletting were therefore rules about the maintenance of the universe, enacted by the specific person whose position made him the most effective possible instrument of that maintenance. The Maya rules about writing and the recording of history reveal a civilization that was deeply concerned with the relationship between the past and the present, between the precedents established in mythological time and the events of current political life. Maya rulers commissioned the recording of their genealogies, their military achievements, their religious ceremonies, and their astronomical observations on stone monuments, stelae, that were erected at regular intervals corresponding to specific points in the long count calendar. These monuments were not simply records. They were claims about the ruler's place in the cosmic order, demonstrations that his reign was correctly aligned with the cycles of time, and appropriately connected to the precedents established by his royal ancestors and by the divine figures of Maya mythology. The rules about the construction and dedication of these monuments were embedded in the ceremonial calendar in ways that required specific astronomical events to coincide with specific moments in the political life of the ruler. A stela erected at the end of a specific period in the long count was more powerful than a stela erected at a different time, because the cosmic significance of the period ending date transferred to the monument and to the ruler associated with it. The rules about timing were therefore rules about the amplification of political authority through correct alignment with the cosmic order, which was the same fundamental principle that organized the rules about the Egyptian pharaoh's conduct and the Chinese emperor's response to celestial phenomena, expressed in the specific form that the Maya understanding of time made available. The Maya cities, whose ruins still impress visitors with their scale and their sophistication, were organized according to rules that reflected the same cosmological theory that organized the calendar and the bloodletting rituals. The orientation of the major buildings was determined by astronomical considerations, with specific structures aligned to mark the rising or setting of specific celestial bodies at specific points in the ceremonial calendar. The spatial organization of the city reflected the Maya cosmological model of the universe as a layered structure with specific directions and levels, each associated with specific colors, specific divine forces, and specific qualities that needed to be honored in the physical arrangement of the human settlement. The rules about the ball game, the sacred athletic contest that was played throughout Mesoamerica, including among the Maya, were among the most elaborate and most revealing in the entire ceremonial system. The ball game was not simply a sport, it was a ritual reenactment of the mythological conflict between the forces of life and the forces of death that was the foundation of the Maya cosmic narrative. The specific rules of the game, which required the players to keep a large rubber ball in motion using only their hips, elbows, and knees, without allowing it to touch the ground, were not arbitrary athletic requirements. They were the specific conditions under which the cosmic conflict was enacted in human terms, with the ball representing the sun and the movement of the ball across the court representing the movement of the sun across the sky. The consequences of the ball game were as cosmologically serious as its rules were elaborate. The loser of a significant ball game, in contexts where the stakes were high enough, could be sacrificed at the conclusion of the game, with the sacrifice understood as the fulfillment of the cosmic narrative that the game had enacted. The sacrificed loser was not simply a defeated athlete, he was the embodiment of the force of death that had to be overcome for the sun to continue its course, and his death was the offering that ensured the continuation of the cosmic cycle that the game had represented. The rules of the Maya writing system are among the most complex and most fascinating in the history of writing. Maya writing is a mixed system that combines logographic signs, where a sign represents a word or morpheme, with phonetic signs, where a sign represents a syllable, in combinations that allow the same word to be written in multiple ways. The rules about how the signs could be combined, how blocks could be arranged within the grid structure of Maya inscriptions, how signs could be modified by attached smaller signs to indicate grammatical relationships, were worked out by generations of scribes who were trained in specialized schools attached to the royal courts. The rules about who could write and read were as socially significant as the rules about what was written. Literacy in Maya civilization was restricted to a small group of specialists, the scribes and the priests, who maintained the knowledge necessary to produce and interpret the inscriptions that recorded the political and cosmological information of the ruling class. The restriction of literacy was not simply a consequence of the difficulty of the writing system, though that difficulty was real and significant. It was a deliberate feature of a social system in which the control of cosmological knowledge was a primary source of political authority, and in which the restricted access to that knowledge was one of the mechanisms by which the ruling class maintained its position. The rules about color in Maya art and ceremony reveal the same cosmological theory of directional associations that organized the spatial layout of the city and the orientation of the buildings. Each of the 4 cardinal directions was associated with a specific color, a specific tree, a specific animal, a specific divine force, and a specific quality of cosmic energy. The correct use of color in ceremonies, in clothing, in art, in the decoration of ritual objects was therefore not simply an aesthetic choice. It was a cosmological statement about the specific divine forces being invoked or honored or represented, and the incorrect use of color was a statement about the wrong divine forces in the wrong context, with consequences that could disrupt the cosmic alignments that the ceremonies were designed to maintain. And now with the Maya we have reached the furthest point of our journey tonight. The civilization that was most completely isolated from the civilizations of the Old World, and that independently developed the most complex theory of time, the most sophisticated writing system, and the most elaborate ceremonial calendar of any New World civilization. The Maya and the Egyptians never communicated. The Maya and the Chinese never met. The Maya and the Han Dynasty officials, who were composing regulated verse in Chang'an at the same time that Maya rulers were erecting stelae in Tikal, were living in worlds so completely separate that it is genuinely remarkable to contemplate the parallels in their concerns and in the rules they developed to address those concerns. Both civilizations were preoccupied with the alignment of human activity with cosmic order. Both developed elaborate calendar systems for identifying the correct moments for specific activities. Both had specialist classes whose primary function was the maintenance of the knowledge necessary to perform that alignment correctly. Both understood the ruler as the primary mediator between the human and the divine. Both built monumental architecture oriented to astronomical phenomena. Both developed writing systems that combined phonetic and logographic elements. Both produced elaborate rules about who could perform which functions, what those functions required, and what the consequences were of performing them incorrectly. The parallels are not evidence of contact or of the diffusion of ideas. They are evidence of the specific challenges that complex urban civilizations face, regardless of their geographic location, and of the specific solutions that human beings tend to develop when they face those challenges. The challenge of knowing when to plant is the challenge of developing accurate astronomical knowledge and applying it through an accurate calendar. The challenge of governing large numbers of people across vast distances is the challenge of developing administrative systems that can transmit authority and information reliably and consistently. The challenge of maintaining social cohesion across generations is the challenge of developing and transmitting shared values through the cultural mechanisms, education, ceremony, art, architecture, of collective life. The rules that all of these civilizations developed in response to these challenges were different in their specific content because the specific cultural contexts in which they were developed were different. But they were similar in their underlying logic because the underlying challenges were similar. The Maya daykeeper and the Egyptian priest and the Han official and the Mongol envoy and the Tang examination candidate and the samurai who wrote his death poem were all engaged in the same fundamental project, which was the attempt to create and maintain the conditions under which human beings could live together in communities large enough to accomplish what no individual could accomplish alone. They were extraordinary, every one of them, in the specific ways that their specific civilizations had shaped them to be extraordinary, and they were ordinary, every one of them, in the ways that all human beings are ordinary, with the same needs for safety and belonging and meaning and the knowledge that the world will continue to function tomorrow as it has today. The rules were the attempt to guarantee that knowledge. They failed sometimes. They succeeded more often than we usually acknowledge. And they were always, underneath their strangeness, the most human thing that any of these civilizations produced. It is very late now. The song examination candidate has put down his brush. The Maya daykeeper has consulted his screenfold book and determined that the dawn will be auspicious. The Gupta mathematician has worked out the implications of 0 for the 4th time this evening, and finally felt satisfied with the result. Ashoka's officials are travelling through the provinces, listening to the concerns of ordinary people and writing them down in the careful script that the empire requires. The samurai is contemplating the brevity of cherry blossoms. The Mongol relay rider is changing horses at the yam station and continuing through the dark. All of them rest now, in their different beds, in their different centuries, in their different civilizations, under the same sky that still contains the same stars that the Maya astronomers were tracking, and the Tang astronomers were measuring, and the Indian astronomers were calculating, and the Egyptian priests were interpreting as divine communications about the state of the cosmic order. The sky is the same. The stars are the same. The human beings looking at them were different in their specific cultural formations, and the same in their fundamental humanity. And the rules they made about what they saw when they looked up, what it meant, what it required of them, how they should respond to the information the sky was providing, those rules were among the most extraordinary things that any of these civilizations produced. Sleep well. The sky is full of stars tonight, just as it was for all the rule makers we have visited. The rules have done their work for this evening. The extraordinary, ordinary human rest begins now, but the night has one more civilization to offer before we rest. Because we have travelled through China and Japan and the Mongol steppe and India and the Maya world, and we have not yet visited one of the most consequential and most misunderstood civilizations of the ancient world. The civilization of the Islamic Caliphate at its height, the Abbasid dynasty centered in Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries of our era, which produced one of the most remarkable intellectual explosions in human history, and which was governed by a set of rules that combined the theological framework of Islam with the administrative inheritance of the Persian Empire and the intellectual legacy of Greek philosophy, in ways that produced something genuinely new and genuinely extraordinary. If you wake up as a scholar in Baghdad in the year 820 of our era, during the reign of the Caliph al-Ma'mun, you are living in the most intellectually stimulating city in the world. Baghdad had been founded only 50 years earlier by the Caliph al-Mansur, the second Abbasid Caliph, as a perfectly circular city whose design reflected a cosmological theory about the organization of space around a sacred center. The city was not simply built, it was calculated. The rules governing its design specified the distances between the concentric rings of the city's layout, the width of the streets, the placement of the markets, the orientation of the Great Mosque, all in a form that expressed the Islamic understanding of the relationship between divine order and human construction. The rules of Al-Mamun's House of Wisdom, the Bait al-Hikmah, were the rules that made the intellectual explosion of the early Abbasid period possible, and they were rules about translation and transmission rather than about original research, at least initially. The Bait al-Hikmah was not simply a library. It was an institution dedicated to the systematic translation into Arabic of the intellectual heritage of every civilization the Islamic world had encountered: Greek philosophy and science, Persian administrative and literary tradition, Indian mathematics and astronomy, Syriac Christian theology and medicine. The rules about how this translation project was conducted, about who was qualified to translate which texts, about how ambiguities in the source texts should be resolved, about what Arabic terminology should be used to render concepts that had no existing Arabic equivalent, were as carefully specified as the rules about any other court function. The specific rules about translating Aristotle into Arabic reveal the intellectual seriousness of the project. A translator who produced a technically accurate Arabic version of an Aristotelian text, but who failed to convey the philosophical subtlety of the original, was not doing his job. The rules about translation quality required that the translator understand what was being translated well enough to make intelligent choices when the source text was ambiguous and the target language was inadequate to the full range of the source text's meaning. This required translators who were simultaneously expert in the source language and the source intellectual tradition, and expert in the target language and its philosophical and scientific vocabulary, which was a rare combination that the Beit al-Hikmah cultivated and rewarded with the imperial patronage that made Baghdad an attractive destination for scholars from across the known world. The rules about intellectual disputation in the Abbasid court were organized around the same principle of open competition between ideas that we saw in the Gupta philosophical debates, but with the specific addition of the Islamic theological framework that required any philosophical position to be consistent with the Quran and the Hadith, or to demonstrate why the apparent inconsistency was not a real one. The Mutakalimun, the practitioners of Kalam, Islamic speculative theology, developed elaborate rules for philosophical argumentation that specified the valid forms of inference, the categories of evidence that could be cited, and the criteria for determining when a philosophical position was compatible with Islamic theology and when it was not. The rules about ijma, the consensus of the community of scholars, as a source of religious authority were among the most important and most contested in the entire structure of Islamic law. The Quran and the Hadith were the primary sources of Islamic legal guidance, but they did not cover every situation that the expanding Islamic empire encountered in its governance of diverse populations in diverse cultural contexts. The rules about how the consensus of the scholarly community could fill the gaps in the primary sources, what counted as genuine consensus as opposed to mere majority opinion, and how the consensus of one generation of scholars bound or did not bind subsequent generations, were worked out in elaborate detail by the founders of the four major schools of Sunni jurisprudence and their successors. The four schools of Islamic law, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi and Hanbali, each had their own specific rules about the sources of legal authority, the methods of legal reasoning, and the application of general principles to specific cases. The rules were not simply different answers to the same questions. They were different theories about what the right questions were and how they should be approached. The Hanafi school, which was the most willing to use analogical reasoning to extend the application of legal principles to new situations, produced rules that were considerably more flexible in their application than the Hanbali school, which emphasized the most literal possible reading of the primary sources, and was most resistant to the use of human reasoning to supplement or modify what the texts said directly. The rules about ijtihad, the independent legal reasoning that a qualified scholar could apply to derive new legal rulings from the primary sources, were among the most consequential in the entire Islamic legal tradition, because they governed the process through which Islamic law could develop and adapt to new circumstances. The rules specified who was qualified to exercise ijtihad, what training and knowledge were required, what the limits on independent reasoning were, and under what circumstances the conclusions reached through ijtihad were binding on other scholars and on the community. The debate about whether the gate of ijtihad had been closed in the 10th century whether the major questions of Islamic law had been definitively resolved by the great jurists of the formative period, and subsequent scholars were limited to applying their conclusions, was one of the most consequential debates in Islamic intellectual history, because it was a debate about whether Islamic law could continue to develop or whether it had reached a final form. The rules about Waqf, the Islamic charitable endowment, were among the most practically important and most socially consequential in the entire structure of Islamic law, and they produced consequences that shaped the physical landscape of Islamic cities, the institutional structure of Islamic education, and the economic life of Islamic communities for more than a millennium. A Waqf was a property dedicated in perpetuity to a charitable purpose, removed from the market economy and placed under the management of a designated trustee who was required to apply its revenues to the specified purpose forever. The rules about what purposes could be served by a Waqf were broad and included the maintenance of mosques, the provision of water to public drinking fountains, the funding of schools and hospitals, the support of scholars and students, the maintenance of roads and bridges, and a wide range of other public benefits. The rules about the management of the Waqf specified the obligations of the trustee, the mechanisms for oversight and accountability, the consequences for misappropriation of Waqf revenues, and the procedures for resolving disputes about the correct interpretation of the endowment's terms. The Waqf system was the primary mechanism through which Islamic civilization funded its educational and cultural institutions, and its rules produced a specific form of institutional structure that was different from both the state-funded institutions of the Chinese tradition and the market-funded institutions of the commercial tradition. A madrasa funded by a Waqf was an institution whose survival did not depend on the continued patronage of any individual ruler, or the continued profitability of any commercial enterprise. It was funded in perpetuity by the revenues of the designated property, which created a degree of institutional stability and independence that was genuinely unusual in the pre-modern world. The rules about the madrasa, the Islamic institution of higher learning, were among the most elaborately developed in the Islamic legal and educational tradition. The curriculum of the madrasa covered the Islamic religious sciences, the Quran and its interpretation, the Hadith and their evaluation, Islamic law and jurisprudence, Islamic theology, and the Arabic language and literature that was the medium of all Islamic scholarship. The rules about how this curriculum was organized, how students progressed through it, what qualifications instructors needed to possess, how the completion of each level of the curriculum was certified, and what the graduates of the madrasa were entitled to do with their qualifications, were specified in the institutional rules of each individual madrasa and in the broader conventions of the Islamic scholarly community. The specific rules about the ijaza, the license to transmit a specific text or to teach a specific subject, were one of the most characteristic and most important features of the Islamic educational system. The ijaza was not a certificate of general educational achievement. It was a specific authorization granted by a specific teacher to a specific student to transmit a specific text or to teach a specific subject. The ijaza created a chain of transmission that connected the current holder of the license back through every previous holder to the original source of the knowledge being transmitted, which in the case of the hadith connected the transmitter back to the companions of the Prophet, who had witnessed the original events. The rules about the validity of this chain of transmission were the foundation of the entire system of hadith evaluation that was one of the most important intellectual projects of early Islamic scholarship. The isnad, the chain of transmitters that preceded each hadith, was evaluated according to specific criteria about the reliability and personal character of each transmitter. The temporal plausibility of the transmission chain given the dates when each transmitter lived, and the internal consistency of the text being transmitted. A hadith with a strong isnad, in which every transmitter was known to be reliable and the chain was temporally plausible, had a higher degree of authority than a hadith with a weak isnad. The rules for evaluating isnads were worked out in elaborate detail by the Hadith scholars of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Islamic calendar, and represent one of the earliest and most sophisticated systems of historical source criticism ever developed. The Abbasid rules about medicine and the hospital, the Bimaristan, were among the most consequential in the history of medicine. The Islamic hospital was a genuinely new institution that had no exact equivalent in the ancient world that preceded it. It was a place where sick people of any religion and any social background could receive medical treatment, staffed by trained physicians and funded by the Waqf revenues that wealthy donors had dedicated to the purpose. The rules about how the hospital was to be organized, what categories of patients it could receive, how the physicians were to be trained and evaluated, what treatments were permitted and what were not, and how the hospital's revenues were to be managed, were developed by the great physicians of the Abbasid period and incorporated into the institutional rules of the hospitals they helped to establish. The rules about pharmaceutical preparation in the Islamic medical tradition were as elaborate as the rules about any other technical practice in the Abbasid intellectual world. The specific preparations, their ingredients, their correct methods of preparation, their dosages, their applications, and the consequences of incorrect preparation were specified in the great pharmaceutical encyclopedias of the period, whose rules about what constituted a correctly prepared medicine were as precise as the rules about what constituted a valid legal judgment. The pharmacist who prepared a medicine incorrectly was not simply making a technical error, he was violating a set of rules whose authority derived ultimately from the accumulated wisdom of the medical tradition that the Abbasid scholars had synthesized from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources, and that the Islamic intellectual framework had incorporated into a comprehensive system of medical knowledge. The rules about Islamic architecture and the mosque reveal the specific form that the Islamic understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human took in the medium of built space. The mosque was not simply a building for prayer, it was a spatial arrangement that embodied the specific Islamic theology about the relationship between the community of believers and the one God. The rules about the orientation of the mosque toward Mecca, the Qibla, were rules about the physical expression of the theological unity of the Islamic community. Every mosque in the world, from Spain to Indonesia, oriented toward the same point, was expressing through its physical orientation the theological reality that the entire community of believers faced the same God in the same direction. The rules about the specific architectural elements of the mosque, the minaret from which the call to prayer was issued, the courtyard with its fountain for ritual ablution, the prayer hall with its rows of worshippers aligned in the direction of the Qibla, were rules about the organization of space for the specific purpose of the collective worship that Islam prescribed. The minaret was not simply an architectural feature, it was the instrument through which the rules about the times of prayer were communicated to the entire community simultaneously, calling people to fulfill the obligation of prayer at the correct times through the human voice that reached from the elevated height of the minaret to the farthest corners of the city below. The rules about the 5 pillars of Islam, the Shahada, the Salat, the Zakat, the Psalm, and the Hajj, are the most fundamental rules of the entire Islamic tradition, and they reveal with particular clarity the specific form of cosmic obligation that Islam specifies. Each pillar was not simply a religious practice, but a specific form of the relationship between the human being and the divine that Islam required. The Shahada, the declaration of faith, was the act by which the individual acknowledged the reality of God and the prophethood of Muhammad, and thereby entered the community of believers. The Salat, the 5 daily prayers performed at specified times in a specified direction, was the act by which the individual renewed and maintained that acknowledgement through the rhythms of daily life. The Zakat, the obligatory charity that every Muslim owed to the community, was the act by which the individual demonstrated that the acknowledgement of God's sovereignty included the acknowledgement that wealth belonged ultimately to God, and was held by human beings in trust for the community. The Psalm, the fast of Ramadan, was the act by which the entire community collectively experienced the discipline of voluntary deprivation as a demonstration of the primacy of spiritual obligation over physical need. And the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim was required to perform once in a lifetime, if physically and financially capable, was the act by which the individual physically enacted the unity of the Islamic community, by joining the millions of believers who came from every corner of the world to perform the same rituals in the same place at the same time. The rules governing each of these pillars were specified in elaborate detail by the Islamic legal tradition, and were the subject of centuries of jurisprudential discussion about edge cases, exceptional circumstances, and the correct application of the general principles to specific situations. The rules about the correct form of the prayer, the specific positions of the body, the specific words to be spoken at specific moments, the correct response to specific disruptions or errors in the prayer, were as precisely specified as any ritual rules in any tradition we have examined. The rules about the Hajj, about the correct performance of the specific rituals at the specific sites in and around Mecca, about the management of the enormous crowd of pilgrims whose collective performance of the same rituals required careful coordination, were among the most practically challenging rule systems in the entire Islamic tradition. And now, with the Abbasid Caliphate, we have completed our journey through the great rule-making civilizations of the ancient and medieval world. We have visited Egypt and Babylon, and the Ottoman Empire. We have spent time in Han and Tang and Song Dynasty China, and in Feudal Japan, and in the Mongol Empire. We have encountered the Maurya and Gupta empires of India, and the intellectual achievements of Ashoka and Aryabhata. We have contemplated the Maya and their extraordinary theory of cosmic time. And we have arrived finally in Baghdad, at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, where the synthesis of all these traditions was being attempted in the most ambitious intellectual project of the medieval world. What connects all of these rules across all of these civilizations and all of these centuries is something that is easy to state but difficult to fully grasp. Every one of these rule systems was an answer to the same question. The question is not simply how do we organize society, which is a question about practical arrangements. The question is deeper than that. It is the question of how human beings, who are mortal and fallible and limited in their knowledge and their power and their goodness, can create and maintain the conditions under which life is worth living, not just survivable, worth living. The distinction matters because survival requires only that people do not kill each other and that the food supply holds. Worth living requires something more, requires meaning and beauty and justice and the sense that the world is organized according to principles that are not simply arbitrary, but that reflect something real about the nature of things. The Egyptian priest who could not eat onions was maintaining a cosmic order that he genuinely believed in, and that gave his life a significance beyond the purely personal. The Han official who resigned his post to mourn his father for 25 months was enacting a theory of filial obligation that connected his individual life to the cosmic principles that the Confucian tradition had identified as the foundation of the social order. The samurai who wrote his death poem was expressing a philosophical understanding of impermanence that gave his death a meaning it would not have had without the aesthetic tradition that had shaped his perception. The Mongol envoy who travelled in safety under the rules of the Yasa was participating in a system that made possible the commercial and cultural exchange of the Pax Mongolica, which was one of the great periods of cross-civilizational contact in human history. The Maya daykeeper who consulted his screenfold book to determine the auspicious days for the ceremonies of his community was maintaining a connection between human activity and cosmic time that gave the entire life of the community a temporal significance it would not have had without the calendar tradition that specified it. All of them were doing the same thing. They were creating and maintaining the conditions under which life was worth living in the specific form that their specific civilization had determined those conditions took. The forms were different, magnificently, fascinatingly, sometimes horrifyingly different, but the underlying project was the same, and the underlying humanity of the people engaged in it was the same. They were us, in different clothes and different languages and different cosmological frameworks and different theories of what the universe required of human beings, but us, with the same fundamental needs for meaning and connection, and the sense that the world is organized according to principles that are not simply arbitrary. We inherit all of these rule systems, not consciously or directly in most cases, but through the accumulated transmission of ideas and institutions and practices that have shaped the civilization we live in. Our calendar is Roman. Our examination systems for allocating social positions are descended from the Chinese model. Our hospitals are descendants of the Abbasid Bamaristan. Our legal traditions carry traces of every legal system we have examined tonight, and dozens of others we have not. The very concept of zero, without which the mathematics that underlies every technology of the modern world would be impossible, was worked out by the Gupta mathematicians of the 5th century. The paper money that organizes our economic life was a Chinese innovation of the Song dynasty. The coffee that many people drink every morning was a beverage that the Ottoman coffeehouse tradition spread from its origins in Yemen to the rest of the world. The extraordinary rules of the ancient and medieval world did not simply end when the civilizations that produced them ended. They dissolved into the general inheritance of human culture and reappeared in forms that are sometimes recognizable and sometimes not, carrying their original logic into new contexts where they continue to shape what is possible and what is not, what is thinkable and what is not, what seems natural and what seems strange. The things that seem natural to us seem strange to the civilizations that produced the rules we have examined tonight, and the things that seem natural to them seem strange to us. The strangeness is not evidence of inferiority on either side. It is evidence of the variety of ways in which human beings have organized the fundamental project of creating conditions under which life is worth living. That variety is one of the most remarkable things about our species. We have not converged on a single answer. We have produced dozens, hundreds, thousands of different answers, each coherent in its own terms, each partial in its limitations, each revealing something about the nature of the problem that the other answers missed. The rules were strange. The people who made them were human. The problems they were trying to solve are still with us, and the solutions we are currently trying have their own strangeness that will be apparent to the people who come after us and look back at our rules with the same mixture of incomprehension and recognition that we bring to the rules we have been examining tonight. It is very late, later than any of the civilizations we have visited would consider an appropriate time to still be awake. The Egyptian priest completed his evening rituals hours ago and is resting in the quarters attached to the temple. The Han official finished his regulated verse at the banquet and has returned to his official residence where his concubines are asleep and his mourning garments are folded in the box that he will open in 3 years when the mourning period is over. The Tang examination candidate put down his brush when the examination period ended and is in a state of exhausted collapse that he will not emerge from until tomorrow afternoon. The samurai is sitting in meditation in the garden of his lord's castle, looking at the stars and thinking about impermanence and the cherry blossoms that will fall in a month. The Mongol relay rider has arrived at his destination and is sleeping the sleep of someone who has ridden for 40 hours straight under the authority of the Paisi tablet that gave him the right to demand fresh horses at every relay station. The Maya daykeeper has consulted his screenfold book one last time and has determined that tomorrow will be auspicious for planting. The Abbasid scholar has closed the translation of Galen that he has been working on all evening and is looking out his window at the canals of Baghdad, reflecting the last light of the lamps. All of them rest now, under the same sky, with the same stars overhead, in a world organized by rules that each of them understood as natural and necessary, and that each of the others would have found incomprehensible and strange. And under those same stars, in that same world, which has changed beyond recognition in the 1,000 years since the last of these civilizations produced its most important rules, you are also resting, with your own rules, your own frameworks, your own specific way of organizing the fundamental project of creating conditions under which life is worth living. You have inherited more from all of these civilizations than you can fully know. And the people who come after you will inherit from you things that you cannot yet imagine. The rules were strange, they were human, they were the most serious thing that any of these civilizations produced, because they were the attempt to answer the most serious question any civilization can face. What do we owe to each other? What do we owe to the dead who made us? What do we owe to the living who depend on us? What do we owe to the future that we are making without their consent? Every civilization we visited tonight had its own answers. None of the answers was complete. All of the answers contained something true, and the truth in each of them is still with us, dissolved into the inheritance of human culture, waiting to be recognized in the forms it has taken on its long journey from the temples of Egypt, and the courts of China, and the tents of the Mongols, and the cities of the Maya, to the world we inhabit now. Sleep well. The rules have finished for tonight. The extraordinary, ordinary human rest begins now, and tomorrow the project continues, as it always has, as it always will, until the last human being makes the last rule, and lays down their burden, and joins all the rule makers we have visited tonight, in the long rest that waits at the end of every life that has been worth living. Sleep well.